Good evening, everybody. Everybody. Or Billy. As you can see, I have sorted out some video cabling issues. Windows 10 has updated itself to my benefit. We're loading chat here, and I want to make sure that I'm on the right thing. Yes, I am. Let's say hi. Hi, Shadow. How's my sound? Okay, yes, I'm getting chat, but it looks like it might log out on me. Okay, so I'm going to keep this short. I was presented with a little bit of an issue this morning, and I dig myself out of a little bit of a hole to make sure that certain events, a chain of events doesn't occur. Most of you will know what I mean. Financially, if one bill goes, sometimes it's a cascade. So I'm putting up a number of my models up for sale that, you know, I've put these up for sale a couple of times. It's just, I sometimes take them off of sale because I really like this. I really like what I've got, and I want to keep most of it. But like I said, I'm in a situation. So most of these kits I have on Facebook. This is an O-scale lobster boat. I built this last year. Now this as a kit is 99 bucks. Make me an offer on it if you want it. Maybe if you like the modeling water series, you can make your own water base for it to put on a shelf if you don't model in O-scale. Oh, I've got other ones here. I just, there they are. I'll also sell the car ferry. I forget what it actually said what the price was on this. I think it was possibly 90 bucks on the kit, unbuilt and painted. This is a little shrimp cutter that I built. It's a nice looking kit. In the end, it's not the video that was made for it. You know who I'm talking about. It doesn't show the character of the kit. It's got all the nice rigging and stuff on it. And I think the kit, I think it was 60 bucks the kit was. And then I've been cleaning up this Abrams bakery all day. I kind of like the potholes in the road. I'm trying to figure out a way to make those potholes look real. Just doing a little bit of work on it. Tonight I'm going to, when I first built this kit, sorry I can't see chat, so if you're saying something to me, I'll get to it in a second or two. So when I built this was, whoa. I think this is the actual first Craftsman kit that I ever built. And The only way I could really tell that would be to go over to the Railroad Road Line forums, and that's a forum that's had a lot of technical problems over the years. So, and I wonder if those posts are even in their archive, which is, I think, the backup. But this is a $250 kit. So, like I said, I'm going to update some of the scenic elements of this. Because it's really old. Spent a number of years up in the rafters, actually. And the surprising thing about it is the windows are crystal clear, still to this day. A little bit of dust on the windows, but that's doesn't hurt anybody. Let's stand this up. I wonder if you can see that proper. Might be upside down. Let's go. I want to see on the camera what it looks like. Yes, sir. Let me turn the screen around and try to combat our issues. Okay. There we go. Just by thinking, using my head. So here's the car ferry again. I've even got the power to shut this thing off. That would be smart. Don't need that one. So I'm going to move on to the shrimp cutter. Gravity test. Oh! I remember I didn't put this in there because I wanted to rig it up. Where was it supposed to be rigged up to? There's so many strings in this thing. This is a pulley system. Or the winch, the main winch. Yeah, that was kind of funny. So here's the boat once again to make sure we got a good photo of it. There we go. There we go. So, like I said, these boats would be great for display models. They're nice and small. Even if you don't have a waterfront on your layout, they would work on a shelf. It would actually give you a chance to teach yourself how to do water techniques. I'm trying to be a salesman here, can you tell? So tonight, make sure this is I gotta make sure it's all focused up. Should stay in focus. Actually, I should flip it. I should get crafty on y'all and flip it like... Okay. So no music tonight, no podcasts, because we're on YouTube and I don't want to peeve anybody off in my time of need. So like I said, this kit was built in 2009. I hope that doesn't screw up our night. So the thing about Scenic Expresses is it's kind of a crutch. And you don't use any product but Scenic Express if you start using them. So I did that at the beginning. And I really don't like the effect 7, 8 years later. They sure looked good then, but now everything's kind of drabby. And doesn't look good in my opinion. So I'm just going to put a little bit of dirt on. This is the fine silt dirt. You can see it's a little chunky in places. I'm going to give it a good spraying so it embeds itself. I'll just leave it for a second, let that settle. And I'll check the chat. What's the chat saying? Hi, Spark. Looks like my Tuesday didn't end up going. I'm supposed to go Thursday now. This is my week as it stands. All messed up. I don't have a coffee cup, but this might suffice. Say hi to Scully. I keep on forgetting to turn the thing over. So I painted this 4x4 here. It's probably more likely a 6x6. Depot buff, but it had already been stained with steel wool and vinegar, so it's really a weathered kind of dirt gray. I don't know if you can see that good. You're gonna have to tell me in the chat. Who dat? Who dat? What'd you do? Oh, it disappeared before I got there. I gotta... Oh, there's a list. Thank you, Captain. I think. Pretty sure about that. 90%. Brr. Excuse me. So this, I remember just when I finished this kit, this is the step I was on. Put the supporting posts underneath the thing. I actually can turn on the second camera and it might give some perspective. And yes, I flipped it by accident. There we go. Camera's been derped around. Just screwing around. Just messing around. You know how it is. Or you probably do. Captain, this is how it is. Cheers. So, because weld bond glue dries so quickly, I'm just going to put a bead of glue on the stick. Wonder if you guys were able to see that. I just used my finger. A bead of glue on the stick. And I'm going to make sure I place it in the right spot so I don't have to keep on moving it. But once it's placed there, it's going to be tacked in. Promise. So now I'm hoping for tomorrow to be a nice day, so that I can photograph this outside. Made it a little big on purpose, and I'm nibbling off each end, making them nice and clean. I just have to cut a wee bit more off, and then I'll cut the other one the exact same size. I cut barely even a 32nd off. Yeah, that's a nice fit. Oh, wonder, can you see that? Right there. Hope you can. That damn camera's in the way again. Well, we'll do this. How's that one? There we go. there we go. Yeah, right there. Okay. Before I glue those in, I want to see what's happening in chat. Uh, oh. Perfect. Perfect. Yuck, yuck, yuck. I wish I could do music, but it's too hard on YouTube. It just make it no fun at all. Over on Twitch, though, guys. You can request tunes, and it's kind of cool. Like, Sparky, you could request Kim Mitchell and show the world. Just saying. I actually have to see the reaction to that one. They can hear you. I wonder if this is working. Yeah, it's working. Guess Sparky's not watching. Add a little bit of water into that. Like some road repair. Excuse me. Whammo! Road repair. So this plaster is all really weak. So what we need to do is impregnate it with a bit of glue. Otherwise it's going to keep on breaking up like that. And the glue's not really going to sink in properly to do something like this. Because of scenic glue, it really won't it won't affect the finish. It won't really give it a shiny finish. It really will just sink in and harden up, which is the specific feature that I'm looking for. Not Here, I'll go play some of these songs. Fuck it. Fuck it. Oh. Hey guys, how are you doing? Hi CB, this is Abrams Bakery. The first Craftsman kit I ever built. There's a couple of things that broke off of it over the years, and I'm just repairing it up and putting it up for sale, as well as a couple of kits. Just doing a little stream here to make people aware, I guess. Ron, I'm doing okay. Actually, I got an interesting call today. I have a potential project of a Chinese coal mine, and it's going to Australia. That's a possibility. I'm sitting here listening to music, and I hope you're okay listening to music too. How's the music? We'll show you, Charles. I've got the air conditioner's on too. That's the other reason for the music. I've got the car ferry, HO scale car ferry, weathered up with the pilot in there. And that model was sold for, I think it was $90. $90 for the model unbuilt, so make an offer. This is the shrimp cutter boat. It's all rigged up. It's got nets in there. The nets were added. That's wedding veil that I added. It wasn't part of the kit. This was a kit. It's $60 was the kit. Make an offer on it. And the last one, well, in Abrams is for sale too. It was $250. Make an offer. This is an O scale. What do I got here? Am I gonna? There we go. I think we're there. This is an O-scale lobster boat. And this was 99 bucks in the box. Comes with a couple of traps and lobsters and the rigging. So don't want to go over the sob story about why I have to do it all, but I got a sob story. I'm gonna turn on the music. Fair warning. Ah! Sorry, that's kind of loud here. Sorry if I just blasted your ears. Terribly sorry. I'm gonna turn off the mic again though. Email me. The email's in the description if you're interested in anything. I could sure use a hand. I gotta let that dry for a second. I wonder how many rules I'm gonna break by doing this. Living the right life of Riley, I guess. Let's do this first. I'll be right back. I gotta go to the can.
Featuring Dave Frary, Doug Pascali, and Jimmy Degnan. Now here's your host, Scotty Mason.
Welcome to the June edition of the In Training Podcast, folks. On this month's podcast, we've got a couple of great interviews. We've got an interview with Bob Hayden, as well as Brian Bollinger of Best Trains. So hang in there, and thanks for joining us.
This is a podcast from back in 2007. I'm sure most of you have heard of Scotty Mason. And this would be considered episode 2. It's actually episode 3. I think that episode 1 is unavailable. Probably because they had so many technical issues, which is something I understand completely. But this is episode 3. I got the whole collection, if anybody's looking. Damn it, I gotta turn it back up.
ScottyMason.com monthly newsletter. It's free. Keep an eye on our website. We'll be announcing the release of our next DVD series, Weathering Freight Cars, soon. This is the Scotty Mason Show.
First thing we want to talk about this month is our new limited edition kit that we're putting out in conjunction with the Craftsman Structure Show. And Doug is responsible for the design, implementation. Well, hell, Doug's doing all the work. So Doug, I'll let you talk about your idea and, give out as much as you can with, I guess, we're not going to tell everything today, but.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's going to be available to anyone who signs up for the Craftsman Structure Show that we're having in November, and that'll be the only place you'll be able to buy it. So it's a very, very limited edition. So if 100 people come to the show, there'll be 100 kits available. If there are 50 people, there'll be 50. So, but it's going to be 2 small kits, or 2 small structures rather, in one kit. 2 food establishments that will be. Well, do we want to reveal what the names are, or do we want to wait? One will be Frary's Barbecue, and the other is going to be another food establishment with George Celios' name on it, and that's sort of still to be determined, but I think it'll be a seafood place, possibly an oyster bar or something.
And have you worked out the design of this?
Yeah, I have the design. I just have to cut the parts and build a little diorama, and then we'll hopefully by the next podcast we'll have images up on the website, on the Craftsman Structure Show website.
And once again, just to reiterate, this structure it's done in conjunction with the fact that we're presenting 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards at the show. One is to Dave, and the other is to George. And it's also in conjunction with the beginning of the Craftsman Structure Hall of Fame. And each and every time we have this Craftsman Structure Show, whether it's annual or whenever the next one is, we will have new inductees. Also, just to kind of reiterate what Doug said, the kit will only be made available to people who are attending the show, who are paid attendees. There will only be the number of kits available, for the number of people that are attending, and those people have the option to buy them. And if they don't buy them, those kits in excess will be destroyed. So this is about as limited edition a kit as you can possibly imagine, and we don't want to sell them commercially. It's kind of a unique thing we're creating here. Anything else about the kit we want to talk about?
That's about it. Like I said, hopefully with the next podcast we can talk about what it looks like and have some images and stuff.
We had we've had a spate of signups since the last podcast, and just so people are clear, the hotel, which is the Holiday Inn in Mansfield, Massachusetts, has blocked a number of rooms in conjunction with the show, and it seems that the people who work the desk and who take the reservations don't really know what they're doing. because I've heard from people again this month saying that the rooms are no longer available for the show, and then I call up and talk to the convention manager, and she informs me that there are still rooms. And the bottom line is, just so everybody knows, that if you do have a problem, please contact either Jimmy, Doug, or I, and we'll get it straightened out, because as long as there are rooms at this hotel, they will continue to block off rooms and give the show rate. Unless the hotel sells out completely, there is no such thing as running out of rooms. So, and as a worst case scenario, there are 3 other hotels within a half a mile of the show hotel. So, it shouldn't be...
Could I ask you a question, Scott?
Absolutely.
How many is a spade? Is that like a touch or a
It's,
few or a handful? Or
It's more than a bushel,
less than a pound?
less than 2 bushels. I don't know what a spade is. That's an old...
It is an old word.
It is an old word. I would think you would know what a spade is.
I do.
What is it?
Use it for digging clams. A clam spade.
No, that's a spade.
Oh.
This is a spate. And we've also had 3 or 4 new dealers sign up in the past week or so. So the show's filling out. We're actually getting pretty close to the point where we're going to be at our limit for dealers. But if you're a dealer and you're still interested, we've heard from a couple of people who've expressed interest. It's time to get off the can and sign up if you don't want to miss out. What else do we want to talk about regarding the show? Don't everyone talk at once? Okay. I wanted to mention this month that Dave and I lost a friend of ours, unfortunately, a gentleman by the name of John Young, who is a model railroader. He was originally from Keene, New Hampshire, and moved to Massachusetts several years ago, and was pretty well known, certainly in this area, and to a degree around the country as a very good O-scale modeler. Unfortunately, passed away after having a heart attack while on vacation in California. And John was a gentleman, and someone that I had known since the mid-'70s when I was first getting serious into the hobby. And as a young guy of probably 13 or 14 years old, the thing I remember most about John was that he always took the time to talk to me, and always took an interest in what I was doing, and answered any questions I had. And it was nice to reconnect with him over the past couple of years and spend some time with him again. And I know Dave and I are sorry to see him go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John. I've known John since 1956. When I was a kid, about 15 or 16, we used to go to a fellow's house in Swampscott, Massachusetts, and I think John at the time lived in Lynn, Massachusetts. The fellow's name was Al Lalim, and he was kind of the man who got me interested in HO scale model railroading from an operator's point of view. Al Lalim, everybody called him Limey. He had a 50s era HO layout in his basement, and on Wednesday and Friday nights, he'd have operating sessions. And I'd always be the dispatcher, and John would always operate one of the yards on the railroad. And John at the time was he was about 5 or 6 years older than me, and I believed he worked at the General Electric, although I don't know that for a fact. We had a great time, and I lost touch with him when I went to college. And again, one day I was in Scott's garage helping build a small model railroad for Jimmy Dignan. And who should come in but John Young? And he looked exactly the way he looked when he was 20 years old. So it was kind of nice to see him again.
Not to poke fun, but he was bald when he was 20 years old?
Well, I mean, you were, but I'm like, come on. No, he was a nice kid. He loved trains. He'd stand in he'd operate that yard all night for 3 or 4 hours. He'd never say a word. One time, Limey, the guy who owned the railroad, caught him lifting up a boxcar with his hand to move it to another portion of the yard because he didn't want to take the time to switch it. And of course, he got a whole ration of bologna for doing that. But he was in his own little world there. He loved doing that.
Well,
Nice-
John, I'm
Nice
sorry.
man. He was a nice man.
Yeah, he was, and he had quite a little skill layout in his house, and I had an opportunity to operate over there once, and evidently I didn't impress anybody because I was never invited back. But John was very much a prototype modeler, and we modeled some similar areas, and I know that he was all excited because his layout terminated at Bellows Falls, Vermont, and my model railroad starts at Bellows Falls, Vermont. So, we always talked about, having some kind of interchange between the two layouts. So unfortunately, that's not going to happen now. But any friends and family of John, we certainly express our condolences. Let's talk about some current events, folks. I got the latest edition of the Narrow Gauge and Short Line Gazette. Has anybody else had a chance to take a look at this?
I may have gotten it, maybe in the pile here, that I haven't gotten to it yet.
Well, the problem is you subscribe to about 20 different magazines,
I know.
and there's no way you get to them all. I don't know why I subscribe. I do know why I subscribe to it. I subscribe to it because it's so well done. The photographs are very nice. It's a well-written magazine. There isn't a whole lot in it that's of great interest to me, but it's such an attractive magazine that I can't help but buy the thing. And the latest issue is no exception to that. There are a couple of really nice articles, one on an SN3 layout, the Denver Rear Grand Western, and there's a lot of detail stuff. We have actually our ad for the Craftsman Show is in this edition, and kind of buried in the back of the magazine, but it's in there. It seems like this issue, more than some of the others, is focusing on Eastern narrow gauge and more specifically Maine narrow gauge, and I wonder if it's kind of a build-up towards the narrow gauge convention, which is in Portland, Maine this year.
Could well be.
Yeah. But there's a nice how-to article on building a pretty unique narrow gauge water tank, which is it's tapered. It's almost conical in shape, but very interesting. And it's one of the last true Craftsman hobby magazines with the inclination going to Ready to Run. I think a lot of these magazines have lost their focus on how to, and it's unfortunate. So.
Well, I've subscribed to this since issue number 1. In fact, before that it was called Fine Lines. And then there was another magazine similar to this that was absorbed by the Gazette years ago. And I like it just to see examples of really nice model building. I mean, for me, I could care less about most of the articles in it, but I read them. But I want to see what people are doing. And this is the only place to really see that.
Yeah, I agree. I know, Dave, you know Bob Brown pretty well.
Yep.
And I've had an opportunity to have some conversations with him, and Doug also knows him pretty well. I don't know, Jimmy, have you ever spoken with Bob?
I have, just on a business one-to-one, so I don't really know him personally.
And he's a true gentleman, and obviously very bright, and just so knowledgeable about the subject matter that ends up in his magazine. And I think people take for granted that it's really broader in scope than most people think. There was I'm sorry, Dave.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say there was also, and Charlie gets his column this month, ironically, because I know we're going to talk a little bit about it later when we talk with Bob Hayden. There is a picture of the HON 30 mini trains set that you folks will be talking about. And Charlie was talking about some of the different, over the years, the different narrow gauge, ready-to-run trains that have been made available to people. And that was really, as we'll discuss later, that was really kind of the first. And there's a whole story behind that you folks will hear. But, has anybody gotten their model railroader yet?
This month I did not get yet.
I think it'll probably pop in my mailbox today.
It's usually about the first week of June for me here.
Well, you're on Cape Cod, so it takes a little longer because what happens is they fly the mail into
Have
Logan
to get the
Airport.
horse over the bridge.
Right, and then they got to pack up the horse and wagon, and off it goes to the Cape. So
One comment I wanted to make about the Gazette. People read the Gazette, but the Gazette's a collaboration between Bob Brown and his wife Irene. And Irene does most of the production work on the magazine. And they spend 2 weeks every period when it's a period to produce the magazine. It's not a monthly. They spend 2 weeks in like lockdown mode putting together the magazine. And his wife does most of the editorial stuff, and Bob has the luxury of doing the product reviews and some of the nostalgic pieces that are in the magazine.
well, just from a production viewpoint, it's printed on high gloss paper, heavier stock. There's really no junk in this thing.
It's also printed on acid-free paper so that it's green. And do you know how difficult it is to obtain on a regular basis if you're a printer, acid-free paper?
So Timothy Leary wouldn't be interested.
Oh, no, not at all.
Okay. And maybe some of our other friends. Anyhow, hey, I wanted to talk this month as kind of our main topic of discussion. Talk about our first Craftsman kit experiences, and I guess this is tantamount to, your first girlfriend. But
I doubt it.
well, for some of
Maybe
us,
for
Dave.
you it was.
For some of us. You know what I mean.
Yeah, sure.
And we all had to start somewhere. And so I guess Dave, as the oldest, we'll give you the honors and tell us about some of the first Craftsman structure kits you built, who made them, what the experience was like, what you learned.
All right. I'd be happy to do that because, in 1952, I bought 2 Ayers lumberyard kits. One I built and one I put away. And I just the other day while I was cleaning out some stuff, I've moved a couple of times in the last 5 years, and I was cleaning out some stuff and I found that other Ayers lumberyard kit. And it was from 1952, and I think it was $2.98. It could have been cheap, could have been $1.98. And Ayers was eventually, I guess, absorbed or combined with the Campbell scale models later on. But that was a wooden kit. It was nice instructions, some plans, and a bunch of sticks. And it was made out of the sticks. This was before the days of basswood. I believe that the sticks were sugar pine. They were all cut. They were dimensionally nice. But there was no white glue in those days. So the whole thing that I built when I was 12 years old was with airplane cement. And if you've ever used airplane cement to glue wood parts together, then you know that it's not the same experience as using white glue, because the airplane cement dries really quick, sets really quick, and it doesn't make a good bond to wood once it skins over. So a lot of these old kits that I made are just, they looked around one day and just fell apart because, the wood had expanded and contracted so many times in my damp cellar that the glue joints all failed.
Well, let me ask you, if there was no white glue, which is, kind of the standard glue for...
About 1955 or 6, I think Elmer's made white glue.
Well, there were certainly wooden models on the market. Obviously, Ayers was an
They
example.
used fish glue and rabbit glue. And fish glue was stuff you could buy I could be mistaken about this because I was about 12 at the time, and I didn't pay a lot of attention to things, but there was some glue you could buy, and it was a powder, and you mixed it with hot water, and it created a really sticky, smelly glue. I think it was either made from rabbit hide or fish, or some part of a fish. And what you had to do, you had to heat it up and you had to paint it on the wood pieces, and it made a really good bond. I mean, they Stradivarius made violins in the, back in the 1400s, 1500s, and they were all glued together with different kinds of glues. And, you know, some of them are still being played today. So the glue was really good. It was just difficult to work with, especially with models, little teeny joints.
That gives sniffing glue a whole new.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And I think the paint that was available at the time was 410M, I believe it was called, and it was a solvent-based paint, and I can remember, I think it was about 35 cents a jar, and about every other jar of it had solidified on the hobby shop shelf. So I was always bringing the stuff back to the guy, you know, because you'd open it up and it'd be a solid mass, or you'd get it at home and you'd get a half a model painted, and then one day you'd come down to finish and the paint would be absolutely solid in the bottle. The other kit I built that I remember, one of the first ones, because I had to go out and find a soldering iron. And my grandfather had a soldering iron. It weighed about 15 pounds, and it was made for soldering, I guess, like jumper cables to the clamps for your car. You know, it was a great big soldering iron. And I tried, and I used it, and I used it with some success. I put together a Sidum or Sudum, I don't know how you pronounce it, warehouse kit, and it was made out of corrugated metal, and the whole thing had to be soldered together. And it was very difficult to do. It all had to be kind of jigged up, and it was a real learning experience for me. And I figured out the difference between a cold solder joint and a hot solder joint. Once I knew that, I was downtown. Off I went.
It's amazing how Craftsman structures have evolved.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, those are two real good examples. You know, the Ayers kits, which were eventually absorbed into Campbell, you know, were sugar pine, which is wonderful wood, but no one would consider using sugar pine anymore. You know, everything is basswood.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the idea, while you were describing trying to solder a Sudum or Soidum or however you pronounce it, kit together, I could feel the hair in the back of my neck standing up. I can't imagine, you know, the amount of work and finesse and, you know, getting the thing, you know, getting a 90-degree angle and everything plumb.
Well, you know, I had the advantage of having a grandfather who was a tinkerer. He built stuff in his cellar. He fixed clocks. He'd tune up your car if it needed. You know, he could do a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. And he was the one that showed me how to block things up, to make little jigs, to hold parts together while you did that. So you didn't need three hands to do the project. You know, he taught me about clothespins, you know, snap-type clothespins, and how you could use them to hold things together. So it was an interesting experience for me. I learned as much from him as I did from buckling down and building the kit.
Jimmy, what was, I know when you were a kid you had some of these, you know, obviously not as old as Dave, but probably some of these similar experiences.
Yeah, my first kit was actually, I think it's how do you say it? Sidum.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember opening the box and it was, I think, what is it? It was mat board or something like that. I mean, it was, you know, it had some sticks in it and it had some corrugated lumber. And I just remember, you know, I was probably 12 or 13 at the time, and I just remember opening it up and looking at it saying, you know, after building my Tyco plastic kits and my AHM, and then seeing this thing, and it was the whole different world it was. And after I put it together, I was pretty impressed with the way it came out. You know, of course, if I looked at it now, I'd probably think different, but you know, those were the old days, and you know, at the time, I'd never heard of fine scale or, you know, anything like that. So I just remember opening that box and seeing cardboard and paper, and the windows were like this clear plastic sheet and had you know, black printed on it for the you know, for the grates and stuff. Yeah, it was quite a kit.
It's amazing because they were crude by anybody's standards.
Yes.
But they were also the standard for the hobby in those days. And there was no such thing as detail castings. You know, you get in a Campbell kit, you'd get you know, some of those red wooden barrels, and you know, they were kind of clunky and out of scale, and the windows had, big sashes on them, and but that's what you cut your teeth on. Doug, I know you just started building Craftsman structure kits about a week ago.
Yeah, actually not that long ago. My first kit was Fine Skills Roadside Delights, which was the gas station and diner, and I think there was a newsstand, and I completely ruined it.
And how long ago was that?
Probably 2000, year 2000 maybe. Yeah, 7 years ago. But yeah, I went through about 3 other kits, fine scale kits, and pretty much ruined all of them, just trying to learn everything I could. But
and why did you ruin them?
Mostly,
how did you ruin them?
Mostly due to heavy weathering. I think I just, I was so fascinated by the fact that you can make these things look old. I made them look like they were just in a dust cloud of soot and coal. It was just over, too much alcohol and ink, too much chalk, and it's still the hardest thing for me to do is to weather subtly, with a light hand. And I guess that's what makes or breaks it sometimes. So I don't even think I have them anymore, but I basically use them, as a sort of a tutorial, which is great, but it's an expensive way to do it.
It's an expensive way to learn. I think the thing that amazes me is that, you're telling us that you started this in 2000 and
3 years later.
Certainly less than 7 years. You're as good a structure builder as I know.
Well, 3 years later was, what year did kit number 10 come out? 2003, right?
2002.
2002, so 2 years later.
2 years.
Yeah.
No moss growing on you.
Well, I had been building models I had gone to school for architecture, so I was building clean models, which I guess is why I wanted to build dirty models, because I was sick of it. But so I already had known how to build models to scale and all that sort of thing. So I had been doing that since I was 15, actually, working for an architect and so forth. So I got a lot of experience doing that. But this was just so different, and all the junk and the details and the weathering and everything had more character. But yeah, Roadside Delights and Seafood Emporium, and I think Bailey's Produce. I completely ruined them. So.
Well, I guess I give you credit for having the courage to even try, because I'm guessing there's many people out there whose Roadside Delights and Emporium Seafood and Bailey's Produce are still sitting in boxes because they're afraid to ruin them.
Yeah.
And, the bottom line is, something, you're going to make mistakes.
Oh, yeah.
And you might ruin a kit or two. But, if you learn and you have fun and you finally get to a point where you're able to put these things together, then it's all worth it.
Yeah.
I think my story is very similar to Jimmy's. I had built, when I was a kid, every Tyco, AHM, Atlas plastic building that ever came out. I was in the hobby shop every day after school. I used to ride my bike up there, and if I didn't have it, it was on my list of kits to have, and eventually I did. And between money that I had earned from allowances and paper routes and birthdays and anything else, it went right there. And I also got a few of those for Christmas, and I got to the point where I ran out. I had built them all. And this hobby shop here in Franklin, and this gentleman who owned the hobby shop is a subject for its own podcast, and that's all I can tell you. This guy was just a piece of work like you can't even believe. But anyway, he had a few of these Sudum kits on the shelves, and I bought one, and it was cardstock, and I opened the box, and I said, "Oh, you got to be, what is this?" But managed to put it together, and I had the first, I guess, I'll call it Craftsman kit, because I don't know if the Sudum kits really count as Craftsman kits. I think that's a different genre. I built I had made my first confirmation, and I had accrued $40 in gifts from people. If I had known, today if I had known then what I knew today about, people bearing gifts, I would have invited a lot more people to my confirmation. But I went to...
I thought you were going to say you would have bought Apple stock with your money.
Well, I would have done that too. But I went to the train shop in Medway where I first met John Young, and bought a Campbell corrugated warehouse. And I didn't have the appropriate tools or glues or paints to put it together, and the instructions were such that they didn't really go into great detail as far as what you needed to successfully put these things together. So not having like a contact cement, I cut out the corrugated siding and tried to glue it on with white glue, and fared about as well as Dave did, trying to glue his kit together. I couldn't understand why the next day the corrugated siding had all fallen off of it. On top of that, there was no painting and weathering instructions, so I ended up, when I finally got the glue to stick after several tries, I ended up with this structure that was just shiny silver. And every time I tried to take a picture of it, the flash would just hit the siding, and just, you'd have a big glare. So I showed it to a few people, and back at the train shop, not knowing any better, and I think their reaction was, "Oh, okay, well, maybe you'll learn." But I think the first successful Craftsman structure I built was South River's Delabar Tap and Die, which was I built it about 1991, shortly after it came out, and when I opened that box, I was scared. But when I saw the structure before I bought it, I knew I had to have it. And I went slow. I went through the instructions, and I was amazed at the results. And that was it. I was hooked from that point on. And
Scott, you talk about successful kits. Just building models. I mean, when you were a kid, every model you built looked fantastic to you.
Yep.
No matter how crude it was, or, But for me, the first successful model, the one that really turned me on, was Alexander's Haunted House.
Ah, sure, yeah.
Remember that kit?
Absolutely.
And I still have that model today. And I have it on a shelf in my workshop, and I look at it a lot, because it's built. See, I don't think my modeling skills have developed, really. My techniques have developed, but I had the same skills now. In fact, they probably have less skills now because I can't see as well as I had when I was 15 years old. I think you have the skills, the hand-eye coordination, all of that stuff.
Sure, it's just a question of developing them.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I got my start building military models, and I took to that pretty easily. And I always understood, you don't want to use too much glue, and put the paint where it's supposed to go. But it was a little difficult to transition into some of these structure kits. But anyhow, anybody want to add anything else to that?
Do you have any of your first models? Any of you guys have any of your first models that you?
I have several. I have probably half a dozen of them.
Yeah.
I don't. No, mine are long gone. All that early stuff. Well, I'm going back to 12, 13, 14 years old, and you get to a point. Well, first of all, my mother was one of these people that was always throwing stuff out behind me, because she was a meticulous housekeeper, and she hated the idea of seeing anything laying around that wasn't being held in someone's hands and being used. So I think her philosophy was, if it sits around for more than a month, it must be trash. And when I think back to all the things that was missing over the years, I can probably point to the wastebasket, and suspect that that's where they ended up.
I just took a diorama I had built years and years ago apart, and of course I carefully cut the buildings off it to save them to use someplace else. And I was looking at one of them, and it's all made out of Strathmore paper. And back in the 50s or early 60s, Jack Work, or was it Alan Armitage, one of those fellows in Model Railroad wrote, I think it was called The Case for Strathmore, and it was all about building models using this high-grade paper. It was essentially poster board, but it had a nice finish on it. And this little structure I just moved probably for the 5th time, took off the 5th place it had been, was one I had built as an experiment to try Strathmore board back, 48 years ago. So,
now that was the material that came in the Sudum kits, correct?
no, the stuff in the Sudum kits was mat board. It was called mat board in those days.
Okay.
It's the same stuff they use now when they mat pictures.
Mm-hmm.
If you take a picture to a picture framer and he cuts a mask, and bevels the edge.
I use it to border my dioramas.
Yeah, sure.
That's why I called it mat board, because that's exactly what it seemed like. It was like a real thick paper.
Yeah.
See, there wasn't a variety back when you opened that Sudum box. There wasn't the variety of papers and construction materials available. And the architects were using, or people like Doug, who were building architectural models years ago, back I guess the late 50s and early 60s, were using Strathmore paper in different, you could buy it in all different plies, I think from like 30 thousandths to 80 thousandths, and with like 5-ply increments in between or something, 5,000th increments. So they were building models and completely out of paper, and they could use the same kind of paper for the walls. They use the 80 thousandths for the walls and the 30 thousandths for the the window trim and stuff.
Well, I've got a story here. I know you folks all know Jim Corcoran, and you've heard me, those of you listening to the podcast have heard me mention him before. Jim is not only a good friend of mine, but he works part-time for me building kits. And Jim is someone who, even though he does fantastic work, is pretty new to craftsman structure building. And I knew he could do this. He scratch-built a footbridge for a model railroad club he belongs to, and did just a wonderful job with the thing. And as soon as I saw that, I said, I got to remember that this guy can do this kind of work. Well, I'll tell the story, although he's sitting here listening and, making funny faces at me. But the first craftsman, and I'll call it a craftsman structure kit for the sake of this story, but I'll let you draw your own conclusions. The first craftsman structure kit he built was the Point of Rock station by Model Tech Studios. And he brought it to my house, and he said, I just bought this thing. I'm going to build it for the club, and I want you to look at it and tell me what you think. Well, I looked at the thing, and I said, where's the wastebasket? You don't want anything to do with this. It's an all-resin kit, and it was the most poorly executed kit I think I have ever seen. All of the walls were uneven in thickness. All of the roof panels were uneven in thickness. The base didn't match the footprint of the base didn't match the outline of the walls that sat on top of it. Jim said, well, I've got to build this thing. He said, do you mind if I build it here and have you watch over me while I do it? I said, fine. I said, but don't ask me to help. I said, because I already hate the thing. So he spent the better part of the next 2 weeks with a file in his hand. And I've never seen anyone show so much patience in my life, because if I were a gambling person, I would have bet a lung that there was no way that this kit could go together. Well, he not only got it together, but he did a fantastic job with it. And it's a testament, I guess, to persistence and patience. And considering he had no skill that had been refined at that point, just a dogged determination to finish the thing, and I guess maybe show me that it could be done despite my negativity.
Well, how did it look?
It came out fantastic.
Good.
It really came out well, and unfortunately, it's a kit that I would not recommend to anybody, especially someone who would never build a craftsman structure. It is as difficult a kit as I've ever seen, and I've spoken to other people who have attempted to build it and have had equal problems with it. But so now here he sits, and I know the four of us have all seen his work, and I think the four of us can all vouch that it's as good as it gets. So I guess my point is that if you're worried about the end result, there's a good example of someone who, through perseverance, really, first time out, did a great job on a structure. So, anyhow, moving on, folks. We've got Brian Bollinger, who is the owner of Bollinger Edgerly Scale Trains, and we're going to pause now, and we're going to talk to Brian. So stay tuned, folks.
Listen up, Craftsman Structure fans. Not all Craftsman Structure kits are created equal. If you're looking for a kit to fit that hard-to-find spot on your layout, or you don't have room for one of the super kits, but you want the detail of a Craftsman kit, look no further than our friends at Foss Scale Limited. Foss has you covered, folks. Got a big space to fill? How about Foss's new limited edition kit, Department of Docks? Create your own waterfront scene or adapt it to fit an inland industrial scene. Either way, you'll have a great-looking structure. Check out all the Foss Scale Limited kits at www.fosslimited.com. Foss Scale Limited also manufactures a line of quick kits to fit smaller spaces. These kits are perfect for modelers who are new to building craftsman structure kits. They're loaded with all the detail you've come to expect from Foss, and they'll fit in the palm of your hand. They're great if you're looking for a project that won't tie you up. All Foss Scale Limited kits can be ordered through the internet. Check out the Foss website at www.fosslimited.com and place your order today.
With us now from the wilds of southern New Hampshire is Brian Bollinger, the owner of Bollinger Edgerly Scale Trains. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks. Welcome, Scott.
Brian, you're somewhat of a newcomer to kit manufacturing. How long have you been in the business, and whatever possessed you to start a company that produces laser-cut Craftsman kits?
I started out probably 10 years ago designing artwork for G-scale trains, which were produced by Charlie O Trains or USA Trains. And I did that for a few years, and it just got more expensive than I could afford to lose money at a time. And I switched over to HO because that seems to be the size with a larger market share. And I have an interest in structures, I guess, more than the trains themselves, so I decided to try the buildings.
I'll just ask my follow-up question. What led you to G-scale trains?
I just like the size of them. They're fun to play with. I used to, in our first apartment that I had when we were married, they were running all over the floor between every room, and they went under the door, they went under our bed, around the living room. It's like a 3-room apartment, a bedroom, a living room, and a kitchen, and the trains went through every room.
So you get up at night to go to the bathroom and stub your toe in a locomotive. Sounds fun.
Yeah, you had a hopper car full of bubble gum, and you spill the gum all over the place. And we had 2 pet chinchillas, like little, I don't know, squirrel-sized rabbits, and they actually rode inside some of the freight cars, and they would ride around the track, so they were pretty fun to watch.
Do you have any pictures of those chinchillas in the cars on your website, by any chance?
No, I don't. I don't even actually know if I have any pictures of them in the cars. That would be pretty funny.
That would be great. What are some of the challenges that you're facing as a kit manufacturer?
Probably my biggest challenge, or the area I would need to work on the most, would be how to let people know I exist, I guess. I go to the Springfield show, and I advertise seasonally in some of the magazines, but I'm still learning I'm still learning marketing.
Well, you told me when we spoke earlier that the first Craftsman structure kit you ever built was one of your own. Why was that?
I purchased a signal tower made by another company, and I thought it was it was Sheepscott, and I like George Barrett, so we're friends. And I thought, I like Boston and Maine, and that was a Boston and Maine prototype, and I thought it would be fun. And on the cover, there's a nice built-up signal tower. And when I got home, I opened the box, and there was like a sheet of clapboard siding with some Xerox instructions on how to trace it and cut it out, and you literally had to do all the work. And I had never done a Craftsman kit before, and actually my first thought was I could do better than this. And I found a set of blueprints for, I don't know if it's the same signal tower or a similar one. My intention wasn't to copy it, but and the first kit that I ever made was the signal tower, and that was the first one I actually ever assembled, was my own kit.
Did you learn a lot from doing it that way? Because usually it's sort of the other way around. I mean, for myself, I built fine scale miniature kits and stuff in the beginning and learned everything I could from those. So you just sort of did it the other way around.
Yeah, I did it backwards, and there was probably a pretty big learning curve. I had a lot of help on the first kit, and if you look at some of the kits that I've produced, like over the last year or so, they're definitely better kits than some of the earlier kits.
What do you think is the hardest part of producing a kit as far as, from start to finish?
For me, it's definitely the instructions. I hate doing the instructions, and The other day I counted up. I actually have 16 kits that are done in the box, ready to go, like 16 different kits, and they don't have instructions. Because by the time I built a mock-up and tested the sides and built another one and painted it, I'm just bored of it. I have too short of an attention span, I guess.
So how many kits actually now then do you have available that somebody can buy?
I think it's about 15.
And who do you look for inspiration? I mean, besides you said Sheepscott, but who else?
Well, obviously George Stelios is definitely someone that would inspire you. South River Model Works. I kind of look at what are the big guys doing, and how can I fit that into a smaller package at a smaller price point.
How long have you been interested in trains? Before you started making the kits, or earlier?
No, actually, it happened on my honeymoon, oddly enough. We went to North Conway, New Hampshire, and they had the steam engine there, and I wanted some pictures in the steam engine, but they wouldn't let me go near the steam engine for insurance reasons. So halfway through the ride, I asked the conductor, I'm like, I'll just give you my camera, and can you take some pictures, and I'll be happy with whatever you give me. And he said, well, you know what, I don't really want to handle your camera because it looks expensive. It wasn't really, but. And so he went up and talked to the engineer, and they let me stand on the side of the railroad crossing when it crossed the street. I think it was Route 16. And he goes, when the train goes by, just hop on the engine and don't tell anybody. And so I rode the second half of my ride in the engine with the guy shoveling the coal and turning all the knobs and stuff. And that just got me hooked. And at the end of the ride, they disconnected the engine, and we went on the roundhouse, and I'm looking out the window, and there's like my brand new bride standing on the side, and I'm waving to her while I back into the roundhouse. Like it was probably bad. I probably paid more attention to the trains than I did to her that day.
So your honeymoon actually may have been better for you than it was for her.
Oh man, I'm not even gonna go there, but maybe.
But there's got to be a joke in there somewhere. I'm searching for it. It's real close to the surface. But that's an interesting story. That must have been a fun time. I've never had an opportunity to have a ride on a steam locomotive, and hopefully someday, I guess. Hey, I know that you just moved into a new house not too long ago, and we talked a little bit about this, but are there plans to build a model railroad, and when can we expect to see some photos of your work?
The new house definitely has a larger workshop space, which was one of my goals when moving. And I have a room set aside in the house that's 12 feet by 40 feet, or 12 by 44, something like that. And right now it has a bunch of memorabilia sitting in it, like lanterns and baggage carts and stuff like that. So I'm hoping that over the summer I can clean up the room and maybe have some bench work going by next winter.
So you've got a design, and
I don't even have a design. I'll probably lay the main line down and then do the branch lines like as I go.
Do you have a feel for what you want to model? What prototype? Is there a prototype? New England, Southwestern?
Yeah, it'll be New England. It'll probably be mostly Boston and Maine. I like the Lake Regions area, and I have a few kits from that area. So I'll probably right now I'm thinking of modeling between Rochester, New Hampshire, and Lakeport, New Hampshire.
I see. And what types, just to get back to your kits for a second, what are some of the kits that you've put out so far?
The smallest kit is a little crossing shanty, and they come like 2 in a pack because they're small. And the largest kit is the Alton Bay Railroad Station that burned down in 1906. I think it was around for about 30 or 40 years. And that kit is about 38 inches long if you do the whole passenger station, platform, and freight house.
And where is that kit based on?
There was a railroad station in Alton Bay, New Hampshire, and I guess there's still one there now, but it's like the third one, and it's a small one. So the one I built was actually the second station to exist in that location.
I see. Now you also bought out the line of Bruce Sparrow's line of shingles. Is that correct?
Yeah, Bruce used to do all my laser cutting for me, and kind of over the years when I was working with him, I had joked around about, hey, when you're ready to sell, let me know, and I just figured he had someone else, that he'd been working with longer, and never I never thought he took me seriously. And then one day he called me up in August of about 2 years ago, and he said, "Oh, I'm ready to sell." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? You got another kid or something like that? You want me to buy it?" And he goes, "No, everything." And we worked out a price, and I asked, I knew it was the fall time, and I said, "You want me to pick this stuff up in like January, February, so you can get your Christmas market?" And he said, "No, just have everything out of my shop by the end of September." So I had about 6 weeks to go from someone who knew nothing about running a laser to owning it and setting it up and doing my own kits.
And what were some of the learning curves you had to overcome?
Keeping the laser in focus is probably the biggest thing. Not being experienced with lasers, I wasn't sure how to tell because the lasers have a gas inside that you charge up to cut the wood with, and I couldn't tell if I didn't have the laser in focus or if I needed to send the lasers out for repair, and it's probably a little bit of both.
Well, Brian, you had mentioned to me a couple of times about your laser. It's sort of a unique setup. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, Bruce was apparently an electrical engineer as far as working with electronic components, and I have a second laser setup that came sits on the table. It's the whole kit and caboodle package, software, computer, everything. But the one I got from Bruce was totally homemade. So the lasers are mounted on a piece of the wood. Those little circuit boards sticking off the side. Wires are everywhere. The power transformers are screwed to the side of a board. It's totally homemade. So as long as it works, then I'm great. If it ever breaks down, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Now, does the Department of Homeland Security know about this one?
Yeah, they do, because when I moved, I created a small explosion, and there was an investigation. I actually wired up one of the lasers wrong, and when I plugged it in, actually a whole bunch of sparks came off my wall. So I have blown a transformer once by accident.
And just to let people know, Bruce's company was Precision Laser Craft.
Yep.
And he had produced a number of different styles of shingles in HO and O. Was it also N?
Yes, N, HO, and O.
And so how many different types of shingles now do you have in the line?
I think there's about 9 different colors. HO has the biggest variety. O and N just have 3-tab shingles right now, but HO has the diamond cut or the shakes, it's like cedar shingles. There's about 9 different colors, and then in HO I think there's 5 different styles of shingles.
So I know scratch builders are always asking me where they can find these types of shingles, and they weather
really well. I know some people manufacture shingles and they crinkle up a lot if you weather them with any sort of liquid or alcohol or whatever. So these seem to weather well.
And they're self-adhesive.
Yep, they're self-adhesive.
Great.
Yes, that's a segue into, Brian, why don't you tell everybody your website and where they can get your products?
The website is www.besttrains, with 2 T's in the middle, .com. And there are probably about 2 dozen stores that carry my stuff around the country. So if you're a dealer and you're listening, give me a call if you want to carry the stuff. I'll plug myself, I guess. Or you can get stuff right online.
Wonderful. Brian, thank you for talking with us. We'll keep an eye out for more kits, and we wish you good luck in the future.
Thanks, Scott.
All right, folks. We're going to jump into our tips and techniques for June. And I've got a new tip for creating a peeling paint effect, and I know Dave's got some techniques that he's going to present to you too. So I guess I'll kick this off. This is a technique that Brian Nolan showed me, and it's a very interesting technique. It's very different than anything I had ever done before, and I really like the results. I'm going to actually demonstrate this technique this weekend at the Proto Meet down in Connecticut. And I know, folks, by the time you hear this podcast, the Proto Meet will be over. But anyway, what you do is you create first of all, you create a concoction. And this is about as caustic a mixture of anything as I've ever seen. And what it is it's about 75% floccular diasol. And into that diasol you mix floccular grime, floccular roof brown, and floccular earth to create the remaining 25%. Mix that well and paint your siding or your strip wood with it. And it creates a stain that's a little browner than say if you were to use alcohol and India ink, which I think is the mixture that most people use for pre-staining wood. But this is kind of a nice effect. Once that dries, you want to get some odorless mineral spirits, and the key here is you want odorless. There is nothing worse than working in a confined space with smelly turpentine or mineral spirits or paint thinner. So make sure it's odorless, and liberally paint the area which you want to show the peeling paint effect. If I'm doing a piece of siding, I'll usually work in probably a 1 inch by 1 inch square, and I want to put enough of this on so that it's not really absorbed into the wood. I want it to puddle a little, and then you choose the water-based or acrylic paint of your choice. In the project that I'm working on, I'm using polyscale aged white, and the key to this is it has to be a water-based paint or acrylic paint, and then dipping the brush into the acrylic paint, you paint it right over the mineral spirits, the puddle of mineral spirits, and as you can imagine, the two don't like each other much. So what happens is the mineral spirits get into a fist fight with the water-based paint, and they fight for supremacy of the surface which they're on, and eventually, as the mineral spirits begins to evaporate, the paint starts to dry but becomes rubbery, and automatically you get a peeling paint effect. And then just to accentuate that, you can take the tip of an X-Acto blade and drag it through the paint, and it will further create the peeling paint effect. After you've done that, you want to set it down and let it dry for about 12 hours, because it takes a while for that mineral spirits to completely leave the surface, and although it's odorless, it still has a faint odor, and the best way to tell that everything is cured and dry is to sniff it. And I know that Doug does a lot of that. But once there is no
explains a lot.
It explains a lot. Once there's no detectable odor, then it's cured. And then what you can do if you want to just create some more accentuation is take a little bit of duct tape, and just like the technique that uses rubber cement, dab the duct tape, press the duct tape against the piece of wood or the piece of siding and pull it off, and you'll actually still be able to pull off a little paint. And it's a very very believable effect, and I'm using it on a project that will become a DVD and actually a diorama that I'll be entering into the narrow gauge competition. So,
Scott, can you use that on plastic parts, or would the mineral spirits sort of damage them?
I would experiment, and maybe Dave knows an answer to this, but I guess my answer would be I would experiment with the
I think the secret to this working is that the mineral spirits kind of get absorbed into the wood a little bit, and you know, oils floats on water, so the mineral spirits is always fighting to come out, you know, to get on the surface, because molecularly it's lighter than water. So and it does, most acrylic paints do not like to be in the presence of any kind of mineral spirits. It does make them rubbery and gooey, and so I think all you're doing is putting a barrier between the wood and the paint, and a controllable barrier, I should say. And I don't think it would work very well on plastic, but you know, I've never tried it, so I can't really.
Yeah, you know, one of the people that eventually we'll interview on this podcast is Mike Tylick, and Mike is a wonderful modeler who works a lot with plastic, and I bet if anybody would know the answer to that, because he's always experimenting, he would be the guy. So we'll have to ask him someday when we talk to him. Dave, what do you have?
Well, a couple of things, and nothing as elaborate as the peeling paint, but
just to interrupt you for a second, I was afraid that I was going to give a technique that might be in your 222 tips book, because every time I come up with something, you tell me you're a dummy. It's right in my
It's in my book.
It's in my book.
Well, you can have your own book. You can have like Scott's 4 best techniques
that have already been covered in Dave's books.
All kidding aside, people who do a lot of kit building, and I have recently. I've been building models like 3 or 4 at a time here. I'm starting this little model railroad, and I've rediscovered wax paper. Now, wax paper has kind of gone out of favor because there's saran wrap and all kinds of Teflon wrapping things that you can use. But I use wax paper as most of you do, for putting it over a template or over a cutting board that has 1-inch squares on it, so that you can set a model up like the 2 walls of a structure and get them at 90 degrees, and the wax paper becomes a barrier between the glue in the joint and the surface that you're setting it on. That's a normal use for wax paper. But what I've been doing lately is I mix all my paints now. For all of the wooden structures and plastic and or plaster structures that I've been building, I've been mixing all my colors so that they're all different and out of the jar colors. And I've found little palettes, like 6-inch squares of wax paper, to be a wonderful disposable palette to mix the paints on. A couple of squirts of one color, a couple of squirts of another color, mix them up with your brush and paint them on. And then when you're all done with the project, take the paper, the square of paper, and throw it away. On that same square of paper, you can also put a couple of drops of white glue or a couple of drops of ACC or canopy cement, and then with a toothpick, pick it up and spread it on the models to create a glue joint. And again, when you're done, you just throw it away. So I've been using a lot more wax paper, and I've kind of rediscovered it because I've been doing a lot of scratch building, and I've been using a lot of wood parts, and I find that mixing the colors, I needed some kind of a palette. Now, you can buy palettes at AC Moore that are essentially a pad of wax paper, and they got a thumb hole in them, and what they're made for is acrylic artists to use as a palette, and when they're done with their painting, they just rip the page off, and they've got a fresh surface to work on.
Well, I was going to say, when you and I work together, I often see you using that, and it seems to work pretty neat.
Yeah.
It's almost like a parchment.
Yeah, well, the stuff that I use when you saw me was, you can get them in craft and art stores, and it's just a pad of wax paper, and it's a pad of artist palettes. Mm-hmm. And all they are is, I don't know, probably like 28-pound or 36-pound paper with a wax coating on it. And you use it. When you're done, mix your paints on it, use it, and when you're done, just tear the page off and throw it away. And I think you get like 100 pages in one of these. But a roll of wax paper works just as well.
Well, I think when you're building scenery, you're always looking for something to, mix some colors on.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think the other thing, too, is that we, as model railroaders, we tend to have blinders on, and we don't really see some of the things that are available to us in the artist community.
Yeah.
Things like this.
I don't like containers, little things with sides on them, because I'm always tipping them over.
No kidding.
So I found that a flat surface and keep your paints fairly thick. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, I have 4 paper cutters in my workshop, small to very large, and I use paper cutters for everything. Everything I cut, just about, I can cut depending on the size of the paper cutter and the weight of the blade and all of that. I can cut stuff up to basswood on it, and I regularly do, just for speed. But originally I used a paper cutter for cutting cardboard strips to be the basis for scenery, for the cardboard strip method of building scenery. And then as I had the paper cutter sitting around the cellar, I started cutting shingles on it and tar paper strips out of black construction paper. And the corrugated siding that you talked about, Scott, in the Campbell kit, I cut corrugated siding on it all the time. And you don't dull a X-Acto blade, and you get a nice clean cut that doesn't really squash the corrugations. It cuts them. And a lot of the structures I build interiors in them, quick and dirty interiors, just so I can put a light, and when you look through the window, you can see something in there. And what I do with the paper cut, I use mat board, and I cut out little squares of mat board and glue them behind the window to create a little room. And then I go into an art catalog or something, or the Sunday paper, any place that has little pictures of rugs or artwork for sale or anything like that. And I cut out all that stuff, and that becomes the interior scene inside the building. You really can't see it. It's just a shape and a color, and with a little bit of illumination on it. It looks like there's something in the room. So the last thing I use my paper cut is for cutting window glazing. You know, I'll measure with a pair of diagonals or a pair of calipers. I'll measure the width of the window and how big the glazing has to be. I'll transfer that mark to the glazing material and then take it to the paper cutter and cut, 500 little squares that'll fit inside the window opening.
That's a pretty good time saver.
Yeah, it is. It is for me because I like to work fast.
Yep. I wanted to talk about a non-structure related product review, and this is a material that many of you have probably already used, but some of you may not have, and it's a material that Dave and I work with almost all the time when we're building scenery. It's a product called Sculptamold. And I'm gonna let Dave describe what Sculptamold is and kind of talk about its uses. And I know, Doug, you also use it for your dioramas.
Every now and then for stone walls and things like that.
Yep. Dave, tell us about Sculptamold.
Well, I really don't know what it's made of. It's a material I use I buy it in 50-pound bags and use it for everything. But it doesn't contain plaster, although I've heard people say that it does. I think it's made of cellulose fibers, clay, and some kind of a plaster or gypsum binder. In fact, it could even be the stuff that they coat paper with that becomes the binder in it. And it's mixed with water, and you can mix it very loose so that it's runny, or you can mix it so that it's stiff and clay-like. And either way, it sets in about 30 minutes, and it dries, depending on the conditions of where you're building, where you're using it. Between overnight, it will dry, or it may take 2 or 3 days for it to dry out completely. And until it actually does dry completely, you can still work it a little bit. Sculptamold doesn't shrink. It's tough. It's lightweight. It takes all kinds of paint. You can put anything on it. And it can be drilled, filed, carved. And I buy it from Scenic Express in Pennsylvania, and they have an ad in the magazines. And if anybody would like the catalog, and I don't get paid to say this, but if you call 1-800 234 9995 is the number, and that'll get you the catalog. And the 3 characteristics of Sculptamold that make it ideal for dioramas and portable scenery is that it's tidy to use. And tidy by that meaning it doesn't make a mess like plaster does. No matter what you do with plaster, you're going to get messy. You're going to have plaster dust everywhere, and you're going to have drops of plaster.
Well, plaster splashes.
Yes.
And the thing I like about the Sculptamold is I think that whatever that paper material is within it absorbs the powder so that it's kind of instead of plaster, which is like napalm, it goes everywhere. This stuff tends to bind to itself.
Mm-hmm. It's a good way to put it.
So it doesn't splash, it doesn't get all over the place. And not to cut you off, Dave, because I promise we'll get back to you, but the thing I like best about it is that if I'm using it as a rough base coat, you can work it right up to the edge and right up against the building, and not have to worry about the stuff splashing all over the building and ruining your work. And if you did get it,
the word for that is controllable.
Controllable. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes.
If you did get it where you don't want it, you just take a paintbrush and some clean water, and you can literally wash it away, which is something with plaster because of the fact that it's ground so fine. it always comes back on you. So, as you were saying, Dave, I'm sorry.
Well, the other thing I like about it is that it has a natural-looking textured surface. And if you mix it with a lot of water and just goop it on with a trowel, you get a surface that looks somewhat like cottage cheese. I don't know how else to describe it. It's kind of pebbly looking. And if you mix it with not as much water, I was going to say very little water, but you want enough water so that it's workable, you can have a surface that's somewhat like rough sandpaper. And it's a good simulation of bare earth or smooth rock. And the other thing is you can mix acrylic paint with Sculptamold to create a color, like an earth color. That's a permanent color. It won't fade. It'll be there as long as the Sculptamold's on the railroad. And if you chip a piece off by moving a portable diorama or something, the part underneath is still going to be earth colored. So the only thing that the paint does in my usage, I've found that the paint weakens the hardness of the Sculptamold a little bit, but other than that, it's perfect it's a perfect way to color it if you want to do that. Now, some people mix Sculptamold with dilute white glue. Instead of using water, they use a dilute white glue, and what you get is a marble-like finished product. Because of the white glues in there, it's somewhat glossy, it's very hard, and it does resemble marble, even though it's very lightweight, because essentially it's cellulose fiber. So I've used it for everything. I've even put black India ink in it and colored it to get it a dark gray color for roads and things, for tar roads. And it works. It works like a charm.
Now, you and I have worked on a number of scenery projects lately together, and it seems to be, the material lately. And
that's all I use. I do not use plaster for anything. I used to use gypsylite. I don't use much of that. I like Sculptamold.
And I think we've probably gone through several hundred pounds of it.
Yeah.
But you used to, you've used other materials in the past. You've used gypsylite.
Mm-hmm.
You've used plaster. What makes Sculptamold better, I guess?
Because it dries because it's ultimately workable. You get 30 minutes to work it. You can make bare earth with it. You can carve rocks with it. And you can carve all kinds of rocks. You can make sedimentary rocks, or as Doug said, you could make rock formations. You could make roads with it. And you don't have to color it, beforehand. You can paint the roads in afterwards. But you can get it as smooth as glass, or you can get it just as rough as cottage cheese or coarse sandpaper. And the fact that it dries in 30 minutes or hardens in 30 minutes, it dries, depending on the conditions, overnight or a little bit longer. And when it's dry, it's really tough, it's flexible, and it's lightweight. And the weight is the thing that gets me. You can build a great big mountain with this stuff, putting on a half-inch coating all over the mountain. And when you're all done, the mountain may only weigh 1.5 pounds. So it's and it's available in a lot of places. Most craft stores like Michael's or Ben Franklin or AC Moore carry Sculptamold. You can buy it on the internet. It's made by American Art Clay, and they're in Indianapolis, Indiana. So you can do a Google search and buy it off the internet. You can buy it through Scenic Express. He sells it in 5-pound bags, I think 10-pound, 25-pound, and 50-pound bags. So if you got a big project, you can buy a lot, and there's a considerable savings by buying a lot of it. And it doesn't go bad. You can leave it in the damp cellar, and it doesn't hydrate water like plaster does. So you can you buy a big bag, keep it for 10 years.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. I've bought large amounts of this stuff, and it never seems to go bad. So it's another
it's my medium of choice right now until something better comes along.
Great. Folks, coming up, we have Bob Hayden from Santa Fe, New Mexico, so stay tuned.
Folks, if you've ever looked at a beautifully scenic model railroad and thought there was no way you could do that kind of work, then listen up, because I have the answer to your problems. Dave Frary, the best-selling author in the history of model railroading, has just made his incredible book, How to Build Realistic Model Railroad Scenery, even better. This all-new third edition contains 144 pages of brand-new tips, tricks, and techniques you need to know to build great-looking model railroad scenery. This isn't just a rewrite of the original book, folks. Dave shows you how easy it really is and backs up his 50 years of experience with hundreds of color photos taken by Dave himself. After you read this book, you'll have the knowledge you need to know to build your own great-looking model railroad scenery. To purchase your very own copy of Building Realistic Model Railroad Scenery, the 3rd edition, log on to www.mrscenery.com and order right online. Mention that you heard about it here, and Dave will even autograph your copy. While you're there, check out all the other great books, DVDs, and scenery supplies any model railroader could need. Once again, the website you need to know is www.mrscenery.com.
All right, in 1961, a friend and neighbor of mine who was an avid HON2 and ON2 modeler told me about a kid who lived on the other side of town. My friend said this kid was a terrific model builder and was building HO and HON2 models. And my friend arranged for all three of us to get together on a Saturday morning to show off our models. The kid's name was Bob Hayden. I knew the name because his father had been one of my school teachers. When we met that Saturday, I was blown away by the quality of the models he was building. We spent an enjoyable day talking about what we were building and talking about the main 2-foot railroads, which was our mutual interest. During the next few years, Bob and I became close friends, building models, rail fanning, and traveling to model railroad shows together. Bob and I have been doing model railroad projects together since those early days. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce my friend, Bob Hayden. Welcome, Bob.
Hey, glad to be here.
Oh, thank you. What influenced you as a teenager and got you started building train models?
Well, I had an uncle, and he was 10 years younger than my father, so he was, I think, only about 10 years older than me. And he had been an HO, and even before that, OO, scale model railroader when he was a teenager, and he had stuff left over. He gave me an unfinished layout, gave me a whole bunch of magazines, and I remember the unfinished layout even had some true scale milled roadbed on it and had some flex track with fiber ties. That exposure to what he was doing and the magazines, of course, was enough to get me hooked. I guess I've been hooked ever since. It's going on 50 years now.
Wow.
Wow, you've been doing it that long, too.
I've been doing it actually 7 years longer than that. Why did you choose the main 2-foot railroads to model, Bob?
Well, I think you'd call it local influence. I was working in the hobby shop, which was right next to the town where both you and I lived, a place called Lynn, and it was Lynn Hobbies. And this was 1960 or 1961, and one of the guys who came in there was our mutual friend Alan Hansen. And Alan was kind of a crazy person because back in the late 1950s, he decided that he could build a model railroad in HON2, which is only 7-millimeter track gauge, just a little bit more than a quarter of an inch. And all his friends, including our friend Al Aleem, who we probably ought to talk about here someplace, told him he just couldn't do it. And Alan was the kind of guy that if somebody told him you couldn't do it, he did it. Anyway, he came into the hobby shop to buy Model Railroader magazine and shim brass and the other stuff that he needed. And I remember one time he brought an HON2 locomotive, and I was just amazed by it. And it wasn't long after that I started going up to Alan's, seeing what he was doing, met you, and decided, well, if that was just the neatest thing I'd ever seen, I should do it too.
Well, that's interesting. When you get out of high school, you went off to Colby College in Waterville, Maine. And during that time period, you and I visited a man named Lawrence Breed Walker. And he lived in a room in Salem, Mass., surrounded by a large collection of New England Railroad photographs. What can you tell us about Larry Walker and what you did for him?
Well, it's an interesting story, and I would say at this late date, I still don't know the whole story. Evidently, Mr. Walker had been a prominent, I think, Methodist minister with a big congregation over in, I think it was Lynn. And he was kind of a fire and brimstone preacher, I guess, and was might have even been on the radio. Something happened to him long before we ever met him, and I'm pretty sure that he contracted polio. This was back before the vaccine was invented, and people did in fact get polio, and it crippled them for the rest of their lives. He had been a rail fan and traveled all over New England. I guess that being a minister meant that he had most of his weekdays available to do this, and there are pictures of him with the Maine 2-foot railroads, with the Maine Central, with railroads in Vermont and New Hampshire. He'd been all over. He'd evidently been well off enough that he had a driver, which I think was just amazing for the 30s and 40s when he was doing this. Anyway, he had a huge collection of photographs, black and white in those days, and he was pretty much confined to a tenement room in Salem, downtown Salem, Massachusetts. And what he did was he sent out pictures to be copied and distributed them among his network of friends, which was fairly common. And then his network of friends provided more photographs, which he had copied and distributed to other friends. What I did for him while I was at Colby was I became the Colby Camera Club, which had a pretty good functioning black and white darkroom. And I sort of became Mr. Walker's subcontractor to print photos, particularly photos that had to be enlarged from small-size negatives. So I spent, I think, three of the 4 years I was in college there, at least one night a week processing prints in the black and white darkroom. I got pretty good at it. Of course, with the digital age, you don't need to do it anymore.
Well, you know, that collection, which was a huge collection, there were filing cabinets all around the walls of this fairly large room that he lived in. And that collection now is at the Beverly Historical Society in Beverly, Massachusetts. And you and I have been there to do research on railroads.
Right. Right. It's a significant resource, and they have a website for the Walker Transportation Collection that people can log on and take a look at.
Yeah. It's quite extensive. You know, after college, you went in the Navy, and during those 8 years, you and I wrote product reviews for railroad model craftsmen. Can you tell us about the process?
Well, I suppose not a great deal to it. When I was in port in the United States, you know, at home port, you could send me some kits, and I could build them and review them, and that was a fairly conventional process. You'd take the pictures. But when I was overseas in Westpac, you would send me cassette tapes where you had dictated notes while you built the model, and then I would transcribe the tapes and revise the wording and make it into a narrative, which became the product review for Railroad Model Craftsman.
Bob, what were some of the difficulties you faced serving on a submarine and still writing all those articles? How were you able to communicate with Dave during that time?
Well, I mean, basically U.S. mail, which meant that there was quite frequently a 4 to 6 week delay between the time Dave sent something to me and I received it. And what I would try to do is turn it around and get it right back to him as quickly as I could to make the magazine deadlines. The only other difficulty that stands out in my mind about serving on the diesel submarine was you only got to take a shower once a week.
You still do that, don't you?
Oh, no. Geez, I'm up to 3 times a week now.
You know, in the 1970s, Tony Costa was the editor of RMC, and he credited us with inventing HON 30, and it's sometimes known as HON 2.5. You know, in reality, we discovered HON 30 trains in a Woolworths department store. The first set I bought was called Mini Trains, and it was imported from Yugoslavia by the Associated Hobby Manufacturers. In the little box was a small diesel engine, 8 cars, 8 curved pieces of track, 1 straight track, and a terminal track. And the retail price on the box was $14.98. Woolworth's price, I believe I paid $6 or $7 for this little train set. You know, years ago you got to meet with the importer of those trains. Can you tell us the story behind Mini Trains and why it was popular?
Well, the interesting thing was it wasn't that popular, and that's why they were being cleared out at Woolworths for $6 a set.
Yeah.
When I was working in the hobby shop in 1960 or in 1961, AHM, which was Associated Hobby Manufacturers, had really a sales bonanza with something called mini tanks, and these were made by Roco in I think Germany, maybe Austria, and they were beautiful HO scale models in injection molded plastic of military equipment. And they sold, I mean, some of them were 39 cents, and then some of them were 89 cents, and then the real big tanks were $1.39. And we couldn't sell these things fast enough. They went out the door by the bushel. People collected them, essentially, because they were absolutely beautiful models. And then AHM, a little later than that, decided that maybe they could repeat the Bonanza if they did mini trains. And these would be an HO narrow gauge system that a guy with an HO standard gauge railroad could add as an industrial operation to what he already had. And they used N gauge, which is 9mm track gauge, and, of course, HO narrow gauge prototypes. And I think it fell flat in its face, to tell you the truth. They weren't popular, and as a result, when we discovered them, maybe, 63, 64,
Yep.
they were being cleared out, sold off for next to nothing, because AHM had miscalculated and made thousands and thousands of these sets, and it turns out there wasn't much of a market for it. Now the things are collector's items.
Yep. When we were using HON30 products, and the original ones, of course, were the mini trains, you and I got together and we built a little model railroad as a test bed for those products, and it was called the Elk River Railroad. And later we built one called Thatcher's Inlet Railroad. And for people who are listening that don't know a lot about HON30, and Bob just explained it, it's HO scale trains running on N-gauge track. Bob, why did this scale and gauge appeal to you at the time?
Well, I've always been an HO scale guy. And as I think we talked earlier, when I met Alan Hansen, I kind of got interested in the main 2-foot gauge. And the first thing I tried to do, just like Alan, was to build something in HON2, which is only 7mm track gauge. And frankly, at the time, which would be, again, the early 60s, it was beyond my skills. I mean, Alan had a great big lathe and a drill press and a milling machine and the knowledge to use them. And I didn't. And at that particular time, you needed all that stuff to build an operating HON2 locomotive and then to build a railroad to go with it. One of the problems we had was the only worms and gears that were available, which were used in HON3 models, simply wouldn't fit between the drivers of an HON2 locomotive. So when N-gauge came along, it looked to me, and I think to other people, as a reasonable compromise to be able to have main 2-foot gauge trains running in HO scale.
Wow. You know, when you leave from the Navy, you and I built the first Carabasset, the original Carabasset and Dead River Railway, which was HON30. We built it in my cellar. And during this time, there was a lot of interest in the main 2-foot railroads. A lot of people were, you know, calling us up and writing us letters and wanted to see it and wanted to build stuff themselves. And all that interest seems to have faded away. There are a few groups on the internet now. But why do you think the interest kind of faded?
Well, I'm not really sure it has, Dave. And I'll tell you, I think back in, the early 1980s, when you and I were publishing a lot of stuff on the work we were doing, it was different, it was new, and of course, something new and different always gets a good deal of coverage and piques some interest. Well, you know, here we are 25 years later, and it's not new and different, but I still think there's quite a bit of activity going on there. In the 80s, there was a lot of commercial activity in that there were 2 or 3 manufacturers in Japan who were making HON 2.5 locomotive kits and car kits and so on and so forth. And there's always been a pretty big segment of the hobby in Japan that is HON 2.5. And a lot of it's based on the main 2-foot roads, and don't ask me why, because I have no idea. It's just always been there. It's been there since, well, I can document it back into the 1960s. Those models are no longer being produced. And in fact, I think 2 of the manufacturers have gone out of business. So that gives the whole thing a little less visibility. On the other hand, in addition to the narrow gauge and short line Gazette, which has covered 2-foot gauge modeling for 35 years, we now have a 6-time-a-year magazine called Main 2-Foot Quarterly that caters exclusively to the ON2 and SN2 and HON 2.5. crowd. So in a way, we've got more stuff than we had back in the 1980s. Maybe we just aren't getting as much press coverage.
Yeah, that could be.
Bob, when you left the Navy, you went to work for Comback. What was your first assignment working there?
I started out there in 1977 as an associate editor in the books department, and my job was to produce books, which I did for the next 15 years.
And you did a lot of good ones. Those years were some of the best, like they're considered the golden years of model railroading. You know, Lynn Westcott, Gordon Odegaard, Jim Kelly, Russ Larson. You must have a ton of memories working with them, but do you have any that really stick out as your favorites?
Well, the most distinctive personality, and I think Dave would vouch for this, having met him as well, was Gordon Odegaard. Because Gordy was a vocational school graduate, where most of the rest of the crowd had been to college. And Gordy was always singing and whistling, telling jokes. He was just fun to be around. He was also a terrific modeler. And he was a little bit like our friend Alan Hansen, that there was nothing he couldn't do. He had all the skills you needed to build a model in any scale or gauge, and he had done it all over the years. But he was just plain fun to be with. The other guys, I mean, I don't want to get too much into personalities here, but basically Jim Kelly taught me to play golf, and he's still a good friend. And Lynn Westcott, who is, I think, by the people who never met him, probably one of the most misunderstood people in the history of model railroading, because he was just an absolute crazy person. He would get interested in something, and that would be his interest for 6 months or 18 months or 2 years. And the best example that most of us were exposed to is, I think, sometime in the late 60s when I was a college kid. He did an all-Shea issue of Model Railroader, which was what he was interested in at the time. And in the magazine business, the problem with that is if you do an all-Shea issue, you really please the people who are interested in Shays, and you completely turn off the people who are interested in everything else. So the interesting thing with Lynn is he would get into something, and, I mean, in a way, turn off his life until he was satisfied that he knew everything there was to know about that particular topic. And it wasn't always just model railroading. He was interested in reel-to-reel tape recording. And when I edited his last 2 books in the, 1978, 79, 1980, he was into personal computers. And this was before anybody had a personal computer, but he had just gotten into it and had, I think, pretty much put together his own word processor at the time, which was just amazing for almost 30 years ago. Those are I think, of that crowd that you mentioned, those are the 2 most memorable personalities, was Gordy Odegaard and Lynn Westcott. And of course, both of them had been there a long, long time.
Bob, while you were a book editor at Comback, what were some of the strategies you used to get people to produce books for you?
Well, there was begging, which seemed to work pretty well. But essentially the idea was to try to find the experts, people with solid experience on any given topic, and then work with them to put together a complete package. And a complete package means not only the text, the words, but we also need good photographs and illustrations to put together essentially something that another person can take and use as an instruction booklet to learn the same skills themselves.
And it turned out that you really didn't need to look much further than Dave.
Well, yeah, I mean, in anything like this, when you're faced with a challenge, you start turning to the people that are already in your network. And of course, Dave was a friend of, even then, of long standing, and he knew an awful lot about building model railroad scenery. I also figured out in about the first month that I was the book editor at Kalmbach that the best-selling book of all time, not only at Kalmbach but probably in model railroading in general, was Bill McClanahan's scenery book, which, good Lord, I think had been first put together in maybe 1950, something like that.
I believe I have the first edition. It was 1950.
Yeah. And, I mean, if you look at that, you don't have to be much of a genius to figure out that you probably ought to do another one, and it just might sell just as well. So we did Dave's, and by golly, it has sold just as well. In fact, it sold even better.
Yeah. It's still out there.
I've got to get that book someday.
There you go.
That was probably the most famous book published on your watch, was the Dave scenery book. How did that idea come about, other than, that there was already a scenery book? And
Well, that's how the idea came about. But let me argue with you. Probably
Yeah.
the most famous book published on my watch was something called Model Railroading with John Allen. Because I still get comments on it on a monthly basis here. John Allen was a guy that certainly influenced me, influenced Dave. He influeed just about everybody of our generation in model railroading. I mean, all the people that I know that took up this hobby and stayed with it kind of refer back to him, because he showed us something that a model railroad could be that nobody else had ever seen before. I mean, a kind of a visual masterpiece. And I know he's a huge influence on George Selkirk and on just about everybody else that I know and talk about model railroads with. But back to Dave's scenery book, I mean, the idea started, as I just described, that it seemed like the thing that people most needed a book about was scenery building techniques. Because it was, well, I mean, it's changed quite a bit in the ensuing almost 30 years, but it was then, and in a way still is, something you can't buy in a box. Scenery is more techniques than it is products. So there was a need for information on this, and I went to Dave. Part of the start of the whole thing was we had just done, gosh, over the past 6 or 7 years, in the early 70s, kind of a loose series of articles in Rare Model Craftsman with Dave's ideas on water-soluble scenery, which were the basis for the book. And then we'd done stories on making and using rock molds, and we'd done a story on dyeing sawdust, if you can believe that. And we'd done water techniques. And we'd even done, I think, a two-parter on processing lichen, which is something I wouldn't wish on anybody. But if you took that information and kind of brought it all together in one place and re-edited it and come up with some new photographs, you had about half a book right there. So we started with that, and then I worked with Dave to come up with an outline of what else should be in the book.
Well, could I interject here just for a second? The thing that made that first book at least workable for me as a writer and workable for the customer, for the consumer, the person building the scenery, was the fact Bob's idea was that it should be like a cookbook, that you find a way that something works, you write it out like a recipe, like for baking a cake, and if the person reading the book could follow the recipe, they could get results that would please them, and it worked.
Well, it's amazing.
And the feedback from an awful lot of the people who bought the book and used it is, by God, they used they bought the materials that Dave recommended. They used his recipes. They followed his directions, and darned if it didn't come out looking like his. So, mission accomplished.
Yep.
It's amazing how much scenery had evolved, and how much that book opened people's eyes. I had the McClanahan book as a young kid, and I looked at some of the processes for building scenery, and they were old, tired, and clunky, not to mention very difficult to execute and get good results. And here all of a sudden was this book where, on recipe cards right in front of you, you had formulas that you couldn't fail if you followed them. And I think the argument that in those days people didn't get to build a whole lot of scenery went right out the window, because here it was made easy for everyone right in front of them.
Well, I built scenery, and I think Dave did too, using the McClanahan techniques. And the thing I remember was that the smell of turpentine just kind of never went away. The basic coloring medium back in those days was oil paints, oil colors from a tube, and the thinner was either mineral spirits or turpentine. And every model railroad, except for the ones owned by smokers, had about the same smell to it, and it was kind of the lingering smell of oil colors and turpentine. It just never went away.
Bob, you became the founding editor and publisher of Fine Scale Modeler magazine. The magazine enjoyed explosive growth, reaching over 100,000 readers in just the first 2 years of circulation. How did you go about starting the magazine?
Well, I was the books editor at the time, running that department, and we had a significant success with another book, and you could almost say it's another scenery book, because a fellow named Shepard Payne, who had done instructions for Monogram for about 10 years, a terrific military modeler, came along and did a book called How to Build Dioramas. And it was just a runaway bestseller, because his techniques were super. I mean, I think they're still pretty much the standard in that area. And our sales and marketing department had a real problem in that here was this book that was selling like hotcakes, and they still couldn't find any place to advertise it. Now, what that means in the publishing terms is that there's a readership out there that isn't being served. In other words, if you got all these people who are military modelers and who will buy this book, and there isn't a quality magazine to advertise this book in, well, there may be an opportunity. And that's what we saw. And in 1981, the company asked me to look into starting a magazine for what we call, at that time, scale modelers or military modelers. So I did, and I found that there was a readership there that wasn't being served. So in 1982, we rolled out a test issue of Fine Scale Modeler. I think we printed 21,000 copies and put them into hobby shops, and by God, they all disappeared. None of them came back. So that was our opportunity, and then the job was to round up contributors and to start doing product reviews and all the other things that a magazine does for this different readership. Now, thank goodness there was some overlap. There are some people who build military models, build figures, paint figures, and also occasionally delve into model railroading. So they were aware of Model Railroader magazine, and my strategy was just to make a magazine for that readership that was as much like Model Railroader as possible. Over the years, and I did it for 15 years, 16 years, I guess, it evolved into a form of its own, which is what you'd expect with any business. But it started out being a clone of Model Railroader for scale and military modelers.
You know, all the time you lived in Milwaukee, Bob, in your basement you built your version, HON 30, Carabasset, and Dead River. Alan Keller came and featured it in one of his videos, and I came and photographed it several times for magazine spreads in Model Railroader. You know, that railroad was the best running HON 30 railroad that I've ever seen, ever, from, you know, all the shows I've been to. How did you achieve the outstanding operation with the HON 30 equipment at the time, you know, which was known for its terrible operation?
Well, thank you for the testimonial.
Well, you once told me the best model railroad you ever saw was Jim Hediger's. That's because he could run the trains just as fast as he could backwards around the whole railroad. Nothing would derail.
Well, in fact, Jim Hediger was the guy that I give a lot of credit to for making that railroad and other railroads that I built run well, because Jim showed me it could be done. I mean, the model railroad, don't take this personally, but all of the model railroads that I was exposed to before I saw Jim Hediger's railroad in Milwaukee didn't run very good. I mean, I've seen railroads where basically a guy would stand at one corner where the train always stopped, and when it got around there, he'd give it a shove to keep it going. And I kind of thought that was...
or he'd whack the tabletop.
Yeah, oh yeah, all of that stuff. I thought that was the way it worked. And then Jim showed me this thing in HO scale standard gauge that just didn't stop, ran perfectly. The cars didn't come uncoupled. The stuff didn't derail. And that was kind of like dawn breaking over Marblehead there. You go, well, heck, if that's possible, I ought to try to do it. So what I learned from Jim and from other people was all the dull stuff in model railroading, which is paying attention to standards. You know, you get the standards gauge and you make sure that all the track is engaged, no exceptions. And you make sure that all the wheels are engaged, no exceptions. And you make sure that all of the couplers are at the right height and work, you know, swivel and the spring works and all this sort of thing. And you make sure that all the the car weights are to the recommended practices. And you make sure that all the wheels pick up. And the other thing, you mentioned some of the HON 2.5 equipment not running very well. Well, you buy a display case and you put that stuff in the display case, and you only run the stuff that runs good. But that's the key to me. I call it bulletproofing. And it's pain. At first you have to learn that it's necessary, which is what I learned from Jim Hediger. But then you have to be really fastidious in applying the standards, so that if something doesn't work, you take it off the railroad and don't put it back until it does. And with the track, you never settle for anything less than pretty close to perfect.
Well, it works. I'm here to testify to that. You know, about 8 years ago when you retired from Calmbach, you and Gloria, your wife, moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Why did you choose Santa Fe, or that area of the country? And tell us about the workshop you built there.
Well, Santa Fe is a beautiful place. You've been here, you've seen it. I'm surrounded by mountains here. I'm 7,000 feet above sea level, and there's not enough water here that another 100,000 people like me are going to move in next door. So I like the beauty. We have 300 days of sunshine a year. Had lived in Milwaukee for 22 years, where you have, I think you have some beautiful summers, but you have just really tough winters. So we moved here for the mountains and for the mild winters. Though just this past winter we had 3 feet of snow on the ground for a month. But that's a once in a 50-year type thing. So it's pretty here, and it's a nice climate in which to live. The addition to the house, which I had built in 2000, is 1,700 square feet, which is bigger than the house we had in Milwaukee. And it houses the office where I'm sitting now, my workshop, and I don't know, about an 850 square foot room in which I want to build a model railroad. It's a freestanding building. It has all its own utilities, and at least in my mind, it's a place where I'm finally going to build a model railroad that isn't in a basement or an attic or a garage or some other less than enjoyable place. Kind of a once in a lifetime thing for me to do. Other people have yachts and car collections. Me, I have this building, which is my luxury.
That's, you know, I've been there and seen it. It's very nice. It's a perfect place to work, especially with the ceiling skylights. You get a lot of natural light, and it's just pleasant. Actually, it's a nice place to make videotapes too. We've made 1.5 there, and it's a perfect place to shoot. Good acoustics and good lighting.
Well, this building's got 19 doors and windows in it, and 10 skylights. So most of the time, at least in the daytime, you never have to turn on any lights here. It's all natural lighting.
Yeah, it's nice. You know, you and I have worked professionally building 7 or 8 model railroads for customers around the country. And in 2000, we had the opportunity to go to Japan and build an HO layout for Tokyo Disneyland for the Tenshoto Corporation. What lessons did you learn from the experiences of going to Japan and or building model railroads for customers that you can apply to your new home layout?
It's a good question. I think the first thing that I would mention is that when you're doing something on a commercial basis, you always look for orthodoxy. You don't experiment. You always use the tried and true stuff rather than anything new, because time is always the most critical element in a commercial product. You just can't go to somebody's house and stay there for a year and build them a model railroad, because either you'll run out of effort or they'll run out of money. And so you've got to use orthodox stuff, not puttering, and typically trade money for the materials that will save you time. The other big lesson, and anybody that's been in any business knows this, is that when you do something like this, you set out to please the customer, not yourself. So if the customer wants bright green trees, by golly, you give him bright green trees.
That's true. Any of the techniques that we've worked on together you're going to apply to your home layout? Probably all of them, huh?
Oh, of course. Yeah, all of them. Sure.
Yeah, sure. Bob, you know, we've written several books together, and more recently you've been producing books for several publishers. A recent book containing techniques for structure builders was called Basic and Advanced Tips and Techniques for Styrene Modeling. You produced this book for Evergreen Scale Models, and it's sold in many hobby shops and through the Evergreen website. You've also done several train books with Dick Dorman of RD Publications and several others. What are you working on now?
Well, I just finished, I think we're going to talk about it later, but I just finished an all-color hardcover photo book on the Cumbres and Toltec, which is a tourist railroad that runs up in the northern part of New Mexico, about 100 miles from where I am. It's quite an impressive thing. It features the photographs of Sam Furukawa, a photographer from Japan. And one of the interesting things we did there was last September we hired a helicopter for a day and went and chased the Cumbres and Toltec trains and got some really spectacular photos at the very height of the fall foliage season. So the book came out great and it's just starting to sell now.
Bob, how could someone go about ordering a copy of that book?
Hey, I think it's www.bobhayden, which is all one word, .com. And there's the cover and sample pages and ordering information there, and we even take PayPal.
Bob, your name is synonymous with Dave and vice versa. How many articles and photographs have the two of you published as a team?
You know, I don't know. Back when we did our 2 tips books, I went through all the magazines and entered the stories in a database because I wanted to be able to canvass them for tips, which is what we did and how we produced 2 books. Back then, it was something like 537 articles and reviews. But that's only through 1991, and of course we've had 16 more years to do stuff. I think somewhere around 600 articles and reviews. And one of the interesting things, both of us don't do it much anymore, but we did an awful lot of product reviews. And I think it's, for your listeners, I think it's interesting to point out that the discipline required to build kits, build models for product reviews is a very valuable way to improve your skills. One of the things that Dave and I have discussed over the years is when you get a kit in the mail that needs to be reviewed in 30 or 45 days, you don't have the option of quitting on it. Among other things, you're not going to get paid until the review's turned in. But that means that you take on kits as challenges rather than something that if you get sick of it, you can quit building. And I learned a lot of new techniques working under that particular discipline where I absolutely positively had to finish the thing and had to get it to where you could take a picture of it to run in a magazine.
And the other, excuse me, Scott, the other thing is when we were building kits for review, we couldn't just throw them together. They had to be built good enough so that we could take a nice close-up black and white or color picture of the kit. You know, and there couldn't be any seams in the joints or, you know, they had to look nice. So that was the photograph, taking the picture was a part of the real discipline of doing a good job because it was going to show up, you know, in a photograph, in a magazine.
You know, in the history of the hobby, you two are really the only team that I'm aware of, and certainly, you know, a very successful example of two people that have been able to work together and flourish together. Why do you think that is, Bob?
Well, there are other teams. I mean, if you go back and look, hell, back in the early days in the 50s, there was a couple of guys that did something called Tuxedo Junction, I think. And the guy was a real good writer, so it made good reading. It was in Model Railroader. And there have been other guys that kind of work together, even in recent years. So we aren't the only ones. However, I think what happened with Dave and I is we had complementary skills back in 1960 or 62 when we started this. Dave wanted to take pictures, and I wanted to write stuff about model trains, and at that particular time, I couldn't take pictures. So between the two of us, we made one author. The other thing is, over the years, we worked together on a lot of projects, and we figured out that it doesn't do any good to argue about the job, whatever the job is. So we just shut up and get the work done. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, it certainly seems that, you know, you two have made a career in the hobby as a result of that. So if that strategy works for you, all the more power to you.
Well, there's always a little luck involved.
Yeah.
Now, Bob, when are you going to start your layout? I mean, if I recall, your building was delivered as one unit, wasn't it? Was that?
Oh yeah, that's the interesting part of the thing. one of the dynamics here in Santa Fe is that we have some very high-end housing here. I don't live in it, but other people do. In fact, I can see some of it from my house. And when you have a high-end housing market, that attracts all the people who build. In other words, if you're given the choice between building a $130,000 house and a $1 million house, you're going to work on the $1 million house, which means it's just hell to get anything built here in anything of modest proportions built here in anything less than a year, let's say. Well, I needed the building right away, and I found an outfit in Albuquerque called Preferred Building Systems, who essentially gets around this dynamic by having what I call a shipyard for building starter homes right next to I-25 north of Albuquerque. And what they do is they build a structure from the ground up on laser-aligned concrete pads, make sure the bottom of it's level, and then when the building is almost done, I mean all the appliances, all the plumbing, all electrical, all the plasterboard, the roof, windows, doors, when it's all done, they essentially build a duplicate of those concrete pads on your property and put the building, which at least in the case of this building, I think it weighed 70,000 pounds, they put it on a flatbed trailer and deliver it to your house and drop it down on your foundation. So it was an interesting process. Plus, it only took 60 days from writing the first check to being in here and working.
That's
I've got
amazing.
pictures of the whole thing.
Hey, Bob, just to get back to the new book for a second, can you tell us how the book came to be, and tell us a little bit about Sam Furukawa's role? I think most people associate him with his time at Microsoft and may not be able to make the connection to to railroading, in this case narrow gauge railroading. But could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Sam retired a couple of years ago, but he was the head of Microsoft Japan, and he was one of the first half dozen people that Bill Gates hired. So as the years went by, he did pretty well with Microsoft. But he has been a railroad enthusiast from about the same time in his life, 12 or 13 years old, as I have been. And, of course, he started out photographing some of the last of the steam trains in Japan. He became very interested in the Cumbres and Toltec, which is probably one of the last two pieces of the 3-foot gauge Denver Rio Grande Western still operating, and certainly the most authentic one. It's 64-mile railroad up in northern New Mexico. And in probably the late 1990s, he started taking pictures of it. And he would fly in from Tokyo or from Seattle. He had homes in both places. And spend 3 or 4 days chasing the trains on the Cumbres and Toltec and taking photographs. And he's a wonderful photographer, so he took some spectacular pictures. In about a year ago, May of 2006, he asked me to produce a book based on his photographs. And he gave me 11,000 pictures from which to start. I chose 237 from the 11,000. In fact, the most difficult part of the whole project was calling every one of those 11,000 photos up on the screen and evaluating it as to whether it should be used and where it should go in the book. The other thing we did to make sure that the book covered the whole line completely was in September last year, we spent 3 days on the Cumbres and Toltec. We took my truck down the back roads to get to inaccessible areas on a Monday. And then on a Tuesday, the Cumbres and Toltec put us on a gas-powered speeder and ran us ahead of the train. So actually gave us permission to stop the train and take pictures. So we did that on half the line. And then on the Wednesday of that week was when we rented a helicopter and chased the train with it. One of the problems, actually it's one of the beauties of the railroad, is that more than half of it runs through virtually inaccessible country. I mean, so what that means is the railroad pretty much looks like it did when it was built in 1880, except the trees are bigger. But that meant that we had to do some extraordinary things to to get some good pictures that are representative of that part of the railroad. Came out pretty good.
And how long did it take you to edit out all those pictures to get what you needed?
I would say about 5 weeks. About 5 weeks of looking at the pictures and winnowing them down to the best ones, and also to the ones that would give a sense of comprehensive coverage of the railroad from one end to the other.
Well, I know...
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, please.
5 weeks of eye strain.
Well, I know Dave and Jimmy have both seen the book, and they say the photographs are spectacular. So I'm sure anybody who picks it up certainly won't be disappointed. Bob, we appreciate you taking the time from your busy schedule to speak with us today, and of course we wish you continued success and good luck with your new book. Folks, if you're interested in picking up a copy of Bob's new book, you can order it right online by logging on to his website, www.bobhayden.com. Bob, thank you very much.
Hey, pleasure to talk to you guys.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
See you, Bob.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Since 1991, South River Model Works has been manufacturing Craftsman structure kits of the highest detail and quality. Each limited edition kit is based on a highly detailed prototype. You know, the kind of structure even your non-model railroad friends notice and admire. Not only are the structures great looking, but they're fun to build. Each kit is backed by an extensive instruction book that guides the builder through the construction process in a clear and concise manner. Check out all the previous South River kits at www.southrivermodelworks.com and take a virtual tour of Bob's wonderful South River and Millville layout while you're there. South River's next kit will be available in October 2007, so keep an eye on the website, www.southrivermodelworks.com, for more information.
All right, guys, let's see. What's going on with our own stuff? Jimmy, how's the layout running?
That's a good question. I'm going to have Scott and Dave Frary come over someday and work on it.
We're going to evidently...
What's the matter?
Well, we've got one... I'm sorry, Jimmy. Go ahead.
Well, we're going to extend it. We know that. But...
You already did that once.
and that was, bordering on sacrilege. The pucker factor was pretty high when you told me you wanted to add a piece onto Dave Frary's model railroad. So, there's one section of track under the coal branch, Dave, that is I think the rails have departed the ties.
Yep, we can fix that.
And I think what we have to do, unfortunately, and I've been putting this off because it's existed for a while, I think we're going to have to cut through some of the scenery.
Well, the way it was constructed originally, it wasn't never made to be portable, as we've discussed before. But that whole mountain, we can take a knife, we can go right around the mountain, lift the top off it, fix the track underneath, and work right on top of the track so you have good access to it, and then put the mountain right back on again with some plastic cloth and some more green texture. We can blend it right in, have it look nice.
Well, it would certainly be nice to have your help on it because I have been reluctant for fear of ruining what I think is really the scenic, the signature of that layout, the signature area. But obviously we need to get that area fixed. Doug, how's the New Haven layout coming?
I actually got to work on it actually this weekend for Memorial Weekend. I had some time. I have
you knew we were going to be talking about it today, so that
actually that's part of what motivated me. So it actually helped a lot. I have all my plexiglass cat-proof sides up now, so that's been helping because the last time we spoke after that, I had lost Ed Folzaz makes those great hydrocal kits, and I heard one of them go crashing to the floor to 6,000 pieces, so that was that. I went right to the Home Depot and got all my plexiglass.
And was the structure destroyed?
Oh yeah, it's gone. It's in the landfill right now.
Ah, wonderful.
So, but I got to... Go ahead.
Is the cat in the landfill?
No,
That's a family member, right?
Yeah, it's my fault. I should have put it in its own separate railroad room, but it's in an open basement with everything else. So, but I did manage to lay some track and actually got a water feature done. which actually Dave's scenery book helped. I had some air bubbles with my Envirotex, and I read in your book that if you just blow on it.
The other thing you can use, Doug, is take a propane torch.
Yeah.
Just light it off and just run it quickly over the surface, and you'll see all the bubbles just disappear.
Oh, that's great.
Actually, what I use is, one of those, the battery-operated lighters that they use to light candles, or I use it to light my gas grill.
Oh, the clickers, yeah.
Yeah, and you run that flame over the top, and it's magic.
Well, it's the same thing. You're just putting carbon dioxide, blowing it over, and you're reducing the surface tension of the Envirotex, and the bubbles come out.
Yeah. In fact, I just went out this morning and bought some Envirotex. I've got a source for it locally. There's a hardware store that carries it, and I'll be using it on this direct buy layout.
Now, I don't know if you folks know, but Home Depot also makes their own Bear brand of stuff that's similar to Envirotex that I've used. And instead of being a 1-to-1 mix, it's 2 parts of the resin to 1 part of the catalyst. But it works exactly the same way. Works as good.
Now, I don't know why I saw it, but didn't someone send you an email, Dave, asking if you had ever used Future floor wax?
Future floor wax, yeah. The airplane and military modelers use a lot of Future floor wax for making canopies, making polishing things like make sports car models, making them look like they've been freshly waxed. They brush on Future floor wax, and it hardens to a tough plastic surface. A model railroader thought that he'd try building water with it because, it does make a hard acrylic surface after it dries. I've never used it, and I'm dying to try it.
Okay, well, maybe that could be your homework assignment for this month, and you can report back to us.
All right. I'll put that in my notebook, my homework folder.
Well, I actually had some folks over yesterday. I had Brian and Jill Bollinger over, ironically. We just ran Brian's interview. And Brian was anxious to see my layout, and so that gave me an opportunity to get down there and at least clean up a little. And, it's so easy when you're down there working to kind of just leave everything where it lays, and, with the idea that you'll get to it and come back. But I actually last night ran some trains for the first time in a little while, and unfortunately I've been so busy that I've kind of neglected the space down there. But Dick Elwell had been over, and we've built a little more scenery. And the wonderful thing is, it's a good news, bad news situation. The good news is we've built a little more scenery. The bad news is that for every foot of hill that we create, we also create the need for about another 150 trees. So, unfortunately, modeling Vermont has its drawbacks, and I'm afraid that
Western Nevada.
Yeah, Western Nevada. I'm afraid that in a basement that's 1,400 square feet of Vermont railroads, that the trees may do me in. So, and I'm working on the scenery in this direct buy layout. It would be really nice if Dave would come up from the Cape and donate a little of his time to.
Yeah, okay. I'll be up tomorrow.
I'm sure the two of us,
Sure, we can whip it out in a couple of weeks
with proper incentive.
With me working and you watching.
Well, just like the good old days.
Yeah.
That formula has always worked for us in the past, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't work in the future. But the scenery, I'm just about done with the waterfront area, and I'll be posting pictures to the Railroad Line Forum when I do get that done. And I've been slowed up a little, partly by my own means and partly through means I can't control. But I'm hoping to be able to put this model railroad in a 14-foot cube truck and drive it to Florida sometime within the next month. I've got other projects that need to be done. I've begun tinkering with the 18-stall South River brick roundhouse and the 7-stall South River brick roundhouse, and I will tell you that I can't imagine how difficult it is to engineer a multi-sided, multi-dimensional structure like a roundhouse out of material like plaster and achieve the kind of success that Bob Van Gelder had in getting everything to fit together. However, having said that, there are still some variations in the thicknesses of castings, especially the floor castings, and they all have to be consistent. And when you're building a 5-stall roundhouse, it's not such a big deal, but when you project that out to 18 stalls, all of a sudden you've got a problem. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is to determine how much sanding and shimming is required to get this floor level, because those rails need to be completely level.
Is it one of those cases, Scott, where if you make a little error at the beginning, it like magnifies itself by the time you get around to like the 15th stall? Yeah.
I'm afraid it is. What he did was he kind of understood that no matter how good his tolerances were, that the potential for this to happen was there. So what he did was he built pilasters out of resin and plaster, and you can place these pilasters have enough of a fudge factor to them so that if you do have a little spaces, you can hide them behind the pilasters. My concern is that by the time I get to stall 18, I could have, a 1/4 of an inch gap. I don't think that's going to be the case, but potentially it could be. So I've got to be very careful about how much sanding I do. I need to do more shimming than sanding. So I'm anxious to get those going too, because Dave, when those are done, this gentleman has requested that we go out and spend 2 weeks in California, getting him started with.
We'll see about that.
With scenery, so.
We'll see about that.
Well, I look forward to spending 2 weeks with you. Oh boy.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Hey, Scott.
Yes, sir.
This might sound excessive, but you could always use a laser level against your rails to see if they're going to be level or not, or if everything's straight. Would that work?
I guess in theory I understand what you're saying. I have no idea in practice how I would get a laser level, down to that level. But the beautiful thing about that whole idea, Doug, is that you're just an hour and 5 minutes away. So any suggestions like that, I'm completely open to.
Yeah.
All you got to do is drive up here and implement them for me.
Well, they have them at Home Depot. They're very affordable now.
I'll tell you, I've used one for years for lining when I'm building model railroads, to align the risers so that the track is absolutely level, or a certain degree of rise on every riser to hold the track bed. It's a wonderful way to do it, because you can set the beam up so that it just skims across the top of each riser, and they're all level with each other. If the level itself is level,
Interesting. Once again,
it's the same way they put up a drop ceiling. You know how you put the side bars up for a drop ceiling. You use one of those laser levels. It puts out a absolutely level beam of light that goes from one corner of the room to the other. Some go all the way around the room. Well, you can use the same thing for building model railroad bench work and laying your track.
We got some email feedback this month, and I'm going to read a couple that I have. I think, Jimmy, did you save the one that you sent me?
No. Yes, I'll look it up.
Okay.
So go ahead.
This is from a gentleman by the name of Malcolm Greig, and I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. It's G-R-E-I-G. He is from New Zealand. And it says, "Hi, Scotty, and you other great guys." That's you guys. I live in New Zealand. And it says, south, in parentheses, south of the South Seas. Thanks for the blogcasts. I really, really look forward to them. I would like to let you guys know that I hope there's more, but I, for one, enjoy your work and learn a lot from your discussions and advice. Thank you. When you live at the end of the world, it's great to have contact with the legends. Well, I can't claim to be a legend, but the other people certainly are legendary in one manner or another. I've brought I've bought products off of Scott, Dave, George, Brett, Daryl, and the guys from Foss and South River Model Works. I've also bought a couple of kits from the guys on the FSM Yahoo discussion site. My message is from the bottom of the world. Model railroad people are the most reliable and trustworthy group of people I have ever met. P.S. I have been an operational police officer for 20 years and have now been a police prosecutor for 8 years.
You're under arrest.
Yeah, I've seen the very best and the very worst of human nature. Unfortunately, Scotty, you no, I'm adding that.
You're under arrest.
I'm embellishing there. You model railroad guys are the very best. Maybe one day soon, my son and I will get over to the United States for a convention or two. I look forward to having maybe a beer or two with the very best of fellows. Well, if he sits down with you, Dave.
With you better get the Mike's Hard Lemonade.
Yeah, he can have several beers. Please pass on my thoughts. Good folks are often not told of their good deeds. You are appreciated. Thank you. Malcolm Grieg, New Zealand. Thank you, Malcolm.
I remember the name.
I've been fortunate to have sold, many DVDs, but I seem to recognize the names too. So
yep.
I appreciate any comments like that. Here's one from a gentleman by the name of Don Tanner. Don is a member of the Railroad Line Forum. Great job on the second podcast, Scott. Much more polished than the first. Well, all we could only go up. Dave Frary is a perfect addition. Okay. I was ADD to your team. I'm actually building my own version of his Model Railroader Cactus Valley project layout. Oh, that's interesting. So I guess I'm a little biased. But seriously, he has done so much for the hobby. It'll be fun to hear about his tips and experiences in future installments. Some of his experiences, folks, you'll never hear about. I'm sorry. Having the call with George Selios worked out really well, I thought. It astounds me that almost all of his kits have come from his imagination and his layout as well. It's probably the one thing that sets him apart from 99.9% of the rest of us out here. Once again, really enjoyed it, and keep up the great work. Don Tanner. Thank you, Don. This podcast hopefully will continue to get better. If it doesn't, then it better. Yeah, Dave has already laid down the gauntlet. Well, all three of you have. It either gets better or your history. So, here's one. This is a little different. This guy by the name of Jim Mangles, and it's Mangels, and I think it's Mangles. I don't think it's Mangels, but it's entitled Podcast versus Newsletter, and this will be featured on WrestleMania. I think it's 28. Scott, have you decided to replace the newsletter with the new podcast format? While the podcast is interesting, I prefer the newsletter. In any case, I am not going to cancel you. Well, thanks, Jim. No, I haven't replaced the podcast with the newsletter. There was no May newsletter, as many of you may have already realized, because I couldn't get it out in May. I had just too much to do, but there will be a June newsletter. At some point, I would like to replace the newsletter with the podcast, but it will not be in the foreseeable future. I think that it's much easier to do the podcast. The concern I have is that I think a lot of people who read the newsletter maybe aren't real comfortable with accessing the podcast. So until I get a better feel for that, I will still be putting out the newsletter, and you can look for the June issue. So, Jim, did you find...
Yes, I did.
The other one. Go ahead.
Well, I don't really want to read the whole thing because it's a lot of praise for CraftsmanKits.com. There's some praise in there for Scott's wonderful DVD series, but the final letter.
Oh, read that.
Oh yeah. The final line of his email was, "Prod Scott to release his next audio. I listen to it nightly. It does wonders for any sleeping problems. You guys are great." So that is from a customer of mine, Rob McKenzie, who's bought a few kits from me. And,
very smart.
Very nice line. Yes.
Yeah. Well, what do you say to that? That's
Sums it up.
Well, all these things are the cure for insomnia. The DVDs, the podcast. I got two more here that I just want to read real quick. This is from a friend of ours, Rich Bobian, and the subject is May Podcast. It says, "Hey guys, I just finished listening to the May Podcast, and as always, These are good for a chuckle while I'm working on some modeling. George's interview was wonderful. Lastly, I was kind of listening with one ear when I could have sworn I heard my name mentioned. I hope it wasn't anything slanderous because...
I edited all that stuff out.
Oh, okay, good.
He's a lawyer anyway.
I had to back the player up a bit to catch the whole thing. I thought I was getting round-shouldered after all the kudos from the railroad line. I must be doing something right if Dave thought the photos looked pretty good. Thanks a lot, Rich. Yeah, you mentioned his photography. And here is one from a guy that Dave knows pretty well. Once again, could you consider breaking them up into smaller chunks? He's referring to the podcasts. I was about an hour into the first podcast when, frankly, the iPod player in the car, which he describes, crashed. What might be really helpful is a table of contents that is correlated to times in the podcast, i.e. Frere's on from minute 12 to 15, and George Selios' interview runs from 45 to an hour and 15. Well, my concern with doing that is that, if we say, okay, Dave is speaking now, Doug is speaking now, Jimmy is speaking now, and Scott is speaking now, then no one will listen to me.
Scott.
Yes.
It means you have to get a producer, somebody to actually sit down and think about these shows before we do them.
Well, yeah, exactly. And Jimmy does a great job of engineering these things, but that's not a task that, this is low budget. And anyway, he goes on to say, I'm still undecided about the Craftsman Kit show, in part because my work travel schedule is so unpredictable that far in advance, and it's signed Dave Emery, who is...
he's a good model builder.
Who is a good model builder. And then the last one says, hey, Scott, not for you to read on the air. Oh well, but I just got through listening to your May podcast on my new computer. The not-so-old and expensive one died a painful to my pocket death. I thought it was awesome. Well, we all think it's awesome, too. Yes, it's a little commercial, and yes, so what? That is what the media is for. The show is full of great information. It's also cool that you have the only Model Railroad podcast up and running. Not that you needed my thumbs up, but people are quicker to complain than to compliment, and I wanted to let you know how much I enjoyed it. John Mattinson, who owns a company called FSMKits.com. So we appreciate all the feedback, both positive and negative, and we take them all seriously, and hope you will continue to provide us with your comments on a monthly basis. As always, you can email me at scott@scottymason.com, and the other gentlemen through their websites. And if you send us an email, regardless of whether you tell us not to read it, we may very well read it, as John Mattinson of FSMKits.com just found out. We may very well read it on the next podcast. So thanks, everyone, for that. Anything else we need to talk about, guys?
I have one thing that I'd like to mention.
Sure.
I know a lot of the people listening are into O-gauge, and not everyone's into HO. And a lot of them are modeling in ON30. And thanks to Bachman and the new ON30 rolling stock that's available, it's made narrow gauge modeling in O-gauge really a lot of fun. Well, there's a new publication. I say it isn't that new. It first came out in 2006. It's new to me. I have the 2007 issue of a publication called the ON30 Annual. And it's published by Chris Lane, who used to be the advertising person at Model Railroading magazine, and it's printed and distributed by Costens Publications. If anybody is interested, this is a wonderful full-color magazine of about 84 pages, I'd say. It's full of how-to-do-it stuff, a lot of nice construction projects, and the OO's 2007 annual has a great article in it. In fact, I've been looking at it while we've been talking here, of how to build 4 little wooden bridges in O-gauge, and they're really nice little projects. And if anybody's interested in seeing more about it or subscribing, they can go to the website, Chris Lane's website, which is www.on30annual.com. ON30 Annual is all one word. So check it out if you're interested.
Jimmy just reminded me that this podcast will be out before the Proto Meet in Connecticut, so I'll give it one more plug. This weekend, Friday, June 1st and Saturday, June 2nd in Collinsville, Connecticut at the Canton Community Center is I believe it's the 5th or 6th annual New England Proto Meet, and I'll be there both days. I'm doing a clinic on building craftsman structures. I'm also doing an ongoing weekend-long clinic on weathering freight cars along with Mike Rose, who worked with me on a two-volume DVD set entitled Weathering Freight Cars, which should be out hopefully soon. We're a little bogged down in editing right now. But if you've got a chance, if you live in this area and you've got a chance to attend this event, it's a great event, very worthwhile, and some really great modelers. So hopefully you can get out. It's supposed to, I saw the weather report, and it's supposed to be kind of lousy this weekend, so maybe a good excuse to get in the car and take a ride. So hopefully we'll see you there. Gentlemen, anything else we need to mention?
Just check out our Craftsman Structure Show and sign up if you haven't already.
Yeah, it's getting to that point where if you haven't signed up and you're planning to go, you need to make some decisions here. We will look forward to seeing you folks again, having you tune in July, and thanks for listening. Take care, folks.
Bye-bye.